He slapped the bill of sale out of Silas Rowan's hand before the ink had even dried. The paper spun in the cold Wyoming air and landed face down in the mud, and every man standing outside Grover Hatch's feed store watched it fall. Nobody moved to pick it up. Nobody said a word. Grover just crossed his thick arms and smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. 3 blind pigs. He said it slowly, the way a man savors something rotten he wants others to smell. You just handed me your last $40 for 3 animals that can't even see where they're walking. He looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, making sure everyone was watching. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Silas Rowan, dumbest purchase in Calder County history. The laughter started low and built fast. If you've ever stood in the middle of a crowd that's laughing at you, not with you, at you, you know that sound doesn't leave your ears for a very long time. Now ask yourself this: what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move something in you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to quit when the whole world told them to, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. You would be amazed. People watching from places I never expected. Don't miss what comes next, because the story of Silas and Hazel Rowan is only getting started. And I promise you, it goes somewhere nobody saw coming. Silas picked up the bill of sale himself. He didn't wipe the mud off right away. He just folded it once, carefully, along the original crease, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat. His jaw was set. His hands, Hazel noticed later when she held one, were trembling, but not from cold. It was a Thursday in late September of 1883, and the town of Delridge, Wyoming Territory sat at the edge of a wide, flat valley where the wind came down off the mountains without any manners at all. There were maybe 200 people living within riding distance of the single main street, and most of them agreed on very little, except apparently that Silas Rowan had just made the stupidest decision of his adult life. He walked the 3 miles home alone. The wagon creaked along the rutted track that wound between dead grass and dried creek beds, and in the back, separated by rough wooden slats, 3 pigs huddled together. They were small. One was a dirty gray, one was pink with dark patches, and the third was almost entirely black except for a white smear across its snout that looked like someone had thrown flour at its face. None of them made much noise. They turned their heads at sounds, a hawk overhead, the creak of a wheel, but their small, clouded eyes tracked nothing. Silas didn't look at them the whole ride home. When he turned the wagon down the last quarter-mile of track toward the homestead, he could already see the chimney smoke rising and the square shape of Hazel standing in the doorway. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with dark hair she kept pinned back because loose hair annoyed her when she was working, which was almost always. People in Delridge had plenty of opinions about Hazel Rowan's figure. They delivered those opinions quietly, usually behind their hands, usually when Silas wasn't around to hear. If Hazel heard them, and she almost certainly did, she gave no sign. She simply went about her business with the same unhurried, methodical manner she applied to everything, and if that bothered people, she supposed that was their problem to carry. She watched the wagon come down the lane. She watched it come slowly enough that she'd already counted the animals in the back before Silas even pulled the horse to a stop. 3, she said. 3, he confirmed. He stepped down and looped the reins around the fence post and didn't look at her immediately. Blind ones. It wasn't a question. She'd already seen the way their heads moved. Grover had them penned in the back, said nobody wanted them, said he was going to... He stopped. I don't know, Hazel. I looked at them and I just thought, how much? He told her. She was quiet for long enough that a less confident man might have started apologizing again. Silas had already apologized twice on the walk to the wagon and once under his breath somewhere around the 2-mile mark. He was fresh out. Hazel stepped off the porch and walked to the back of the wagon. She didn't reach in immediately. She stood at the slat opening and waited, and after a moment the gray pig pressed its snout forward and sniffed the air near her hand. She stayed still. The pink one shifted. The black and white one made a low, uncertain sound. They're scared, she said. They've been in that pen since August. Grover said, I know what Grover said. Half the valley heard what Grover said. She reached in slowly, palm up, and let the gray pig find her hand on its own terms. They're scared and they're underfed and they've been living in strange-smelling dark for 2 months. She paused. That's actually not the worst starting point. Silas stared at her. Hazel, we have $14 left. I know. 14. And winters, I know when winter is, Silas. She still hadn't looked at him. She was watching the pig, the way it moved its snout along her fingers, reading her the only way it knew how. I'm not saying it was the wrong call, he said. I'm saying I don't know what we do now. We feed them, she said. We keep them warm, and we don't panic. That last part was mostly directed at him, and they both understood that. The homestead had been a gamble from the start. Silas had come out from Illinois 3 years earlier with a decent sum of money, strong hands, a young wife, and a level of optimism that the Wyoming territory had been systematically dismantling ever since. The first year, a dry summer killed most of the garden. The second year, they'd managed a real harvest, enough oats, enough corn, enough root vegetables that they'd thought they might finally have their feet under them. Then in early August of this third year, a fungal blight moved through the corn like smoke, quietly, and by the time either of them understood what they were looking at, nearly a third of the crop was gone. They'd sold what they could, they'd stretched every meal, they'd had conversations in low voices after dark, sitting close to the lamp, calculating and recalculating numbers that kept coming up short. Silas had started going to Delridge every Thursday, hoping to find day work, any work, and finding less and less of it as more men came looking. It was on one of those Thursdays that he'd stopped to talk to Ed Purdy, whose family ran a cattle operation north of town, and Ed had said something Silas hadn't been able to get out of his head. Only way to make money in this valley right now, Ed had said, is to find something nobody else wants and figure out what they missed. He hadn't meant it as advice exactly. Ed Purdy talked the way some men do. Opinions delivered like gravel from a loose tailgate, scattered everywhere, not meant to be collected. But Silas had collected it anyway, and he'd turned it over every night for 2 weeks, and then he'd walked past Grover Hatch's feed store and seen 3 small shapes in a side pen, and heard Grover say to a neighbor, almost offhandedly, "Gonna have to put those 3 down. Nobody's touched them since August. Blind pigs. Useless." And something in Silas had stopped. He didn't know anything about raising pigs. He'd grown up around horses and basic crop farming. But he stood at that fence for a long minute, watching those 3 animals navigate their small pen with something that looked, he thought, maybe foolishly, like stubborn dignity. They didn't crash into things. They moved carefully, noses working, ears rotating. They'd learned their space. They weren't panicking. He thought, for no logical reason, of Hazel. Then he'd ask Grover how much. The first week was the hardest. Not because of any disaster, because of the weight of having made a bet with money they couldn't afford to lose, and having nothing to show for it yet, except 3 small pigs who ate whatever Hazel put in front of them and sniffed every corner of their new pen with exhaustive thoroughness. Hazel watched them constantly. She kept a small notebook, the same one she'd been using for household accounts, and she began adding observations on the back pages. Not in any organized way, just notes. Gray one favors left side of pen near post. Pink one startles at high sounds, not low ones. Black and white one is bolder. First to approach. Silas watched her watching them. "You're taking notes," he said one evening. "I'm noticing things." She didn't look up from the page. "There's a difference." "What kind of things?" "The way they navigate. They follow scent trails they make themselves. Once they've walked a path twice, they can walk it again without hesitating. They memorize space." She tapped her pencil on the notebook. "They're not less intelligent because they can't see. They're intelligent in a different direction." Silas looked at the pigs, who were currently engaged in a highly organized investigation of the feed trough. "What does that mean for us practically?" "It means if we arrange their space intelligently, and we're consistent, same feeding spot, same time, same approach, so they recognize our smell before we get close, they won't be stressed. And animals that aren't stressed convert feed to weight better. Their bodies aren't burning energy on fear." He sat down on the fence rail. "Where did you learn that?" "I read." She finally looked up. "And I watch. And I think. Same as anyone." She said it without an edge, which somehow made it more pointed. He knew she'd spent plenty of time in Delridge listening to people assume the opposite. It was in the second week that Marta Voss came by. Marta was the wife of Rolf Voss, who ran the grain operation 2 miles east, and had been in this valley nearly a decade and considered that tenure a kind of authority over everyone who'd arrived since. Marta herself was a sharp-eyed woman who collected information about her neighbors the way some people collected fine china, carefully, on purpose, for display at the right moment. She arrived unannounced on a Tuesday, which was itself a kind of message. Announced visits meant something different than unannounced ones. Hazel was in the pig pen when she heard the horse. She straightened up, tucked her notebook under her arm, and came out through the gate, latching it behind her. "Marta," she said. "Hazel." Marta's eyes went immediately to the pen, then to the notebook under Hazel's arm, then back to Hazel's face with an expression of someone trying not to look as curious as they were. "I heard what Silas bought in town last week." "I imagine you did." 3 blind pigs." She paused, waiting for Hazel to fill the silence. Hazel didn't. $40. "Close enough." Marta looked at the pen again. She took her time about it. "You know, my Rolf said—" She hesitated. "He said it kindly. He said you two have been having a hard go of it, and sometimes people make decisions out of desperation that they wouldn't make otherwise." It was a sentence designed to land like a hand on a shoulder, but it landed like a boot on a step instead. Hazel heard the kindness in it and heard everything underneath the kindness. "That's very thoughtful of Rolf," she said. "He's wondering if you'd consider selling them, the pigs. He'd give you $30 for all 3, just to help you recover the loss. And then you'd have cash for supplies before—" "No," Hazel said. "Hazel, no thank you." She held the notebook a little tighter. "We're not selling them." Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then her gaze dropped, just briefly. That particular kind of drop that starts at the face and moves downward, and then came back up. Hazel had seen that look her entire life. She'd gotten very good at not reacting to it. "Well," Marta said, "I suppose you know your own situation best." "We do," Hazel said pleasantly. "Thank you for coming by." After Marta's horse had disappeared around the bend in the track, Hazel stood for a moment in the yard. She breathed through her nose slowly. She went back into the pig pen. She knelt down beside the black and white one, who immediately pressed its face toward her hand. "Don't worry about it," she said quietly, to herself as much as the pig. What nobody in Delridge understood, what even Silas didn't fully understand yet, was that Hazel had been preparing for this moment for years without knowing it. She'd grown up in a household where nothing was wasted and nothing was easy, the daughter of a woman who'd spent 30 years making something out of very little with a determination so quiet it was almost invisible. She'd watched her mother stretch meals, repair things instead of replacing them, observe patterns in weather and soil and people, and use those patterns before anyone else even noticed them. Her mother had never been celebrated for any of this. She'd just been the woman who somehow always had food when others didn't, who somehow always knew which neighbors were struggling before they said so, who somehow turned disaster into inconvenience with such consistency that people eventually stopped wondering how. Hazel had inherited that gift, or earned it watching, or some combination of both. She didn't talk about it much because she'd learned early that explaining yourself to people who'd already decided what you were was a waste of breath that could be spent on something useful. She'd also learned something about fear. Fear was the thing that made people sell too soon. Fear was the thing that made people cut corners and rush decisions and mistake motion for progress. She'd watched fear run through Delridge all summer like a cold wind. She'd felt it herself, lying awake at night counting and recounting their shrinking stores. But she'd also noticed something. The people in this valley who'd built anything lasting weren't the ones who'd reacted fastest. They were the ones who'd held on longest without losing their heads. The pigs were not a guarantee. She wasn't naive enough to think that. They were a chance, and a slim one, and there were 100 ways it could still go wrong. But she was done waiting for the odds to improve on their own. By the 4th week, a change was visible to anyone paying attention. The 3 pigs had begun to fill out. Their coats lost the dull, rough quality that came from poor nutrition and chronic stress. They moved through their pen with increasing confidence, following the scent trails they'd worn into the earth, finding their feed trough and their water and their sleeping corner with the efficiency of animals who'd stopped being afraid of their environment. Hazel had reorganized the pen twice based on her notebook observations, moving things slightly to create cleaner pathways. She'd started adding crushed dried clover to their feed mix. She'd found a stand of it along the creek bank and harvested it herself. And within 10 days, the gray pig in particular had shown a visible improvement she could only attribute to that addition. Silas had begun watching her watch them in a different way. Not the way he'd watched in the first week, with the fidgety energy of a man trying to believe in something he wasn't sure of. Now he watched with something that was closer to fascination. "The gray one recognized your voice before you got to the pen today," he said one evening. "I was watching from the barn. It lifted its head when it heard you coming." "I know," she said. "I've been coming at the same time every day, same path, same sounds." "They know who you are. They know what I represent." She corrected herself, then reconsidered. "Maybe the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard Ed Purdy in town yesterday. He said Grover's been telling people we'll be gone by December." Hazel looked at the feed in her hand. Then she put it in the trough, slow and steady, the same as always. "Let him say it," she said. "It bothers me." "I know it does." She straightened up and looked at him directly. "But every hour you spend being bothered by Grover Hatch is an hour you're not spending on things that matter, and we don't have hours to waste." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him wanting to argue, wanting to say that it wasn't that simple, that pride was a real thing, and what people thought about you had real consequences in a small valley where everyone knew everyone. And she could see him decide instead to let it go. That decision, she thought, might be the most important thing he'd done since buying those pigs. It was in early October, on a morning with frost for the first time, that Silas came in from the pen with a look on his face she couldn't immediately read. "Come and see," he said. She put down the bread she was shaping and followed him out into the cold. The 3 pigs stood in their pen, and there was no other word for it, thriving. Not just surviving, not just stable, thriving. Their coats caught the thin morning light with a warmth that had been absent 2 months ago. They stood with an ease that came from bodies that were genuinely healthy, not merely functional. The black and white one heard them coming and turned its head and made a sound that was neither alarmed nor demanding, just acknowledging. Silas put his hand on the top rail of the fence and didn't say anything. Hazel stood beside him and didn't say anything either. After a long moment, he turned to look at her. And she could see for the first time since that day in town when Grover Hatch knocked the bill of sale into the mud, that the fear had left his face. Not replaced by certainty. Certainty was a luxury neither of them had earned yet. But the fear was gone, and what was there instead was something she recognized. Belief. Not in magic. Not in luck. In the work they'd done, and the care they'd put into it, and in each other. She turned back to the pigs. "We need to start planning the smokehouse," she said. He blinked. "The smokehouse. If these animals are going to be worth what I think they're worth, we need to be able to process them ourselves. Not sell them live to someone else who'll take most of the profit. Process them here. Control the quality." She'd been thinking about this for weeks, assembling the idea piece by piece the way she assembled everything, quietly, practically, without announcing it until it was ready to be announced. "I've been looking at the limestone outcroppings on the east side of the property. We have good clay along the creek. Silas, we have most of what we need already." He was staring at her. "You've been thinking about this since the 3rd day," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet." The frost sat on the dead grass around them, and the pigs moved in their pen with their particular careful grace. And somewhere down in the valley, Grover Hatch was probably still telling people the Rowans would be gone by December. Hazel Rowan pulled her coat tighter and turned toward the limestone outcroppings on the east side of the property. She had work to do. The limestone didn't cooperate. That was the first thing Hazel learned about building a smokehouse, that every material had its own opinion about what it wanted to do. And limestone's opinion was that it wanted to stay exactly where it was, thank you very much, embedded in the frozen earth on the east side of the property like it had been put there by someone with a serious grudge against the Rowan family. Silas swung the pickaxe for the better part of 2 mornings before he broke enough free to make a real start. His hands blistered on the 2nd day. He didn't mention it. Hazel saw the way he held his coffee cup that evening and didn't say anything either, just set a jar of rendered lard on the table near his hands and let him decide what to do with it. That was how they communicated in those early October weeks, in gestures and proximity and the things left unsaid that both of them understood. They'd been married 4 years, long enough to have gotten past the politeness of early marriage and into the more honest territory where you knew the sound of someone's frustration before they opened their mouth, where you could tell from the angle of a shoulder whether things were going well or badly out at whatever they'd been working on. Things were going slowly. That wasn't the same as badly, but at certain points of the day, it felt close enough. The plan for the smokehouse had taken shape over several evenings at the kitchen table, Hazel sketching with a pencil on the back of a flour sack, while Silas held the lamp at the right angle. She'd never built anything like this before. Neither had he. What she had was logic, a strong sense of how heat and smoke moved, and 3 visits over the years to her uncle's operation in eastern Illinois, where he'd cured hams in a stone building she'd spent a disproportionate amount of time examining as a teenager while everyone else socialized. She'd thought at the time that she was just curious. Now she understood she'd been storing information the way her pigs stored spatial maps, carefully, for a future she couldn't see yet. The foundation needed to sit on solid ground below the frost line. The walls needed to be thick enough to hold a slow, even temperature. The door needed to seal well but not airtight. The vent needed to draw without pulling too hard. These were the parameters, and within them she worked backward from what the final product needed to be, which was a space that could hold a consistent temperature in the low range for weeks at a time, fed by hickory that she'd asked Silas to source before she even told him the full plan. He'd come back from the Enders' property, a failed homestead 2 miles north that had been abandoned for 18 months, with a wagon load of seasoned hickory from a woodpile the previous family had left behind. The wood was good, dry and dense, the kind that burned slow and even and gave off a smoke that didn't bite. "How'd you know Enders had hickory?" he'd asked when he got back. "I didn't," she said. "I hoped. Hickory doesn't grow natural around here. If someone planted it or hauled it in, they had a reason." She touched a piece of the wood, knocked it with her knuckle, listened to the sound. They were serious people, whoever they were, just ran out of time. Silas looked at the wood for a moment. "Hope we don't end up the same." "We won't," she said. Then more honestly, "I don't think we will." He accepted that. They both knew the difference between a promise and a best guess, and at this point in their lives, a solid best guess was something they'd learned to respect. It was during the second week of construction that the first real problem arrived, and it arrived wearing Rolf Voss's hat. Rolf Voss was not a cruel man in the direct sense. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He dealt in implication and precedent, in the unspoken understanding that in Calder County, things worked a certain way, and people who understood that did fine, and people who didn't understand it eventually figured it out through inconvenience. He rode up on a gray horse on a Wednesday afternoon, when Silas was in the east field and Hazel was the only one working at the construction site, moving clay from the creek bank in a wheelbarrow and packing it into the spaces between the limestone blocks she and Silas had already set. She heard the horse and straightened up and waited. "Hazel," Rolf said. He had a broad, weathered face and pale eyes that looked friendly at first until you noticed they were doing more calculating than most people's eyes did. "That's coming along." "Slowly," she said. "What is it you're building, exactly?" He asked it like he didn't already know. "Smokehouse." He nodded, looking at the half-built walls with an expression that could have been appreciation and could have been assessment. Good-sized one. "We want to do this right." He was quiet for a moment. He moved the reins slightly in his hands, a habit he had when he was getting to the point. "My Marta mentioned she came by. Said you weren't interested in selling the pigs." "That's correct." "I understand." He looked down at his horse's neck, then back at her. "I want to say something to you, Hazel, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's meant." She waited. She'd found that this particular sentence usually meant someone was about to say something they knew she wouldn't like, and they wanted credit for the delivery. "This is a hard valley," he said. "We've all seen families come through here thinking they could make something out of a bad situation, and we've seen most of them leave. Not because they were weak, sometimes because they just waited too long to see what wasn't working." He paused. "Now those pigs look better than I expected, I'll grant you that. But processing your own meat running a smokehouse operation that takes equipment and experience and customers and—" "Rolf?" she said. He stopped. "I've heard the argument," she said. "My husband has heard it. We've heard it from several people now, in several forms." She picked up the wheelbarrow handles. "We appreciate the concern. We're going to keep building." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes did that thing again. The thing Marta's had done. That slight downward movement, the inventory, before returning to her face. "You're a determined woman," he said. She couldn't tell if it was meant as a compliment. "I'm a practical one," she said, "which right now looks the same." He rode away, and Hazel put another load of clay into the wall, and she was aware, in the way you become aware of things when you're building something in a place where people are watching, that Rolf Voss was not done with this conversation. He'd just relocated it somewhere she couldn't hear. What nobody had told Hazel about building a smokehouse, what no one could have told her because you had to discover it yourself, was that the physical work was the easy part. The easy part was the hauling and the setting and the mixing and the aching back at the end of the day. Those were things you could measure. You could look at a wall at the end of a day and see what you'd done, place your hand on the limestone and feel the solidity of it, know that it would still be there tomorrow. The hard part was the doubt. It came at night, mostly. After Silas was asleep and the fire had burned down and the house was quiet, and the only sound was wind against the walls, and sometimes, faintly, one of the pigs shifting in their pen. The doubt didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself like fear did. It crept in like cold air under a door and settled in the chest and asked very quiet questions. What if the pigs didn't grow to the size she was counting on? What if the smokehouse, built by two people who'd never built one, didn't hold temperature the way she thought it would? What if she'd read everything right and still something unforeseen happened? An illness, a hard freeze too early, something breaking that they had no money to fix? What if Grover Hatch was right, not because he was smart, but simply because the odds were what they were? She didn't answer the questions. She'd learned a long time ago that the doubt questions weren't really questions. They were a form of weather, and you didn't argue with weather. You just waited for it to pass and then went back to work. But some nights she lay in the dark for a long time before it passed. Silas didn't know about those nights, or if he did, he didn't say. He had his own version of them, she was certain. They just had an unspoken agreement not to compare weather reports after dark. On a Saturday in mid-October, Hazel drove the wagon into Delridge alone to buy supplies. Not the supplies they needed for the smokehouse. Those were sourced locally and carefully, traded for where possible, paid for in small amounts. These were household basics. Salt, vinegar, a length of cotton cloth for a shirt Silas needed. Small purchases that still required real money and careful math before she left the house. She knew what walking into Delridge alone looked like. She'd been doing it for 3 years. She understood the value of carrying yourself like you had somewhere to be and someone expecting you, because people in small towns responded to purpose the way dogs responded to confidence. They either got out of the way or they didn't, and there wasn't much you could do about the ones who didn't except keep walking. She was loading the salt into the wagon outside Donahue's general store when she heard her name. Clara Purdy, Ed Purdy's wife, was crossing the street toward her. Clara was a small, energetic woman who Hazel had always liked reasonably well, partly because Clara said what she thought directly, rather than through implication, which Hazel found refreshing even when what Clara thought was inconvenient. "I heard you're building a smokehouse," Clara said, not as a greeting, not as a question. "We are," Hazel said. "On your own?" "Silas and I, yes." Clara looked at her with an expression that was frank curiosity rather than skepticism. "How do you know how to do that?" "I watched one built when I was young, and I've been thinking about it for a few weeks now." Hazel lifted the salt sack and positioned it. "What do I not know that I should?" Clara blinked, apparently not expecting to be turned into a resource. "Well," she thought about it, "the vent draw. That's what my father always said was the make or break. Too much draw and the smoke moves too fast doesn't penetrate. Too little and you get pooling and the heat's uneven." She paused. "Do you have someone who can look at it before you seal the top?" "Not yet," Hazel admitted. "There's an old man named August Fenner who lives in a shack about 8 miles north. He used to cure meat professionally back in Missouri before he came out here. He's half deaf and he doesn't like most people, but he knows more about smoke and fire than anyone else in this county." Clara tilted her head. "He helped my father once, years ago. He might come out if you asked him right." Hazel looked at her. "How do you ask him right?" "You don't waste his time. You show him you've already done the thinking and you just need a second set of eyes. He can't stand people who haven't done the thinking." Clara paused. "And you bring him something good to eat. He lives alone, and he eats badly. Hazel drove home with the salt and the vinegar and the cloth, and one additional thing she hadn't expected: a name. Its son. August Fenner took some finding. Silas drove the wagon north on a Thursday, Hazel beside him with a covered pot of beef stew, the last of the jarred beef they'd been rationing since August, a not insignificant sacrifice that Silas noted and didn't comment on. The track north was rough, and the shack, when they finally found it set back in a stand of scrubby pine, looked like it had been built by someone who considered shelter a minimum requirement rather than a preference. Fenner himself appeared in the doorway before they'd even fully stopped. He was a thin, sharp-featured man somewhere past 70, with the kind of stillness about him that came from decades of living alone and having no reason to perform for anyone. He looked at them for a long moment. "You the ones with the blind pigs," he said. It wasn't a question. Silas glanced at Hazel. "News travels. I hear things." Fenner's eyes moved to the covered pot in Hazel's hands. "What's in that?" "Beef stew," she said. "I didn't know if you'd eaten." He looked at her long enough to make a younger, less certain woman look away. Hazel looked back evenly. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to look at our smokehouse before we seal the vent. I want to know if the draw is right." She shifted the pot slightly. "We've done the thinking. I'm not asking you to do it for us. I just want to know if we've missed anything." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the place where a smile would go in a man who hadn't used that particular expression in a while. "Come back Thursday," he said. "I'll be there." He took the pot, went back inside, and closed the door. That was the entirety of the interaction. Silas looked at the closed door and then at Hazel. "That worked," he said. "Clara said not to waste his time," she said. "I didn't." The Tuesday before Fenner was due to come, Hazel discovered the problem with the northeast corner. She'd been checking the walls, running her hand along the inside surface, checking for gaps, the way she'd been doing every few days, when she found it. A section in the northeast corner, about 2 feet up from the floor, where the clay hadn't bonded properly to the limestone. It looked fine from a foot away. It looked fine in dim light. But when she pressed her fingers to it and felt the slight give, the hollow sound when she tapped it, she knew. She stood there in the half-built smokehouse in the cold October afternoon and said a word she didn't normally say out loud. Then she went and found Silas. He pressed his own hand to the section and felt the same thing and said a different word, slightly louder. "How much do we have to tear out?" he asked. She was already calculating. 3 courses up, maybe 4. This section and about, she measured with her arm, 2.5 feet in either direction. She straightened up. 2 days' work at least. Maybe 3. He put his hand on the back of his neck. "Fenner's coming Thursday." "I know." "If we don't have this corner rebuilt before—" "Silas." She turned to look at him. "We tear it out. We do it right. If we have to put Fenner off until the following week, that's what we do." She looked at the corner. "I'd rather have him look at a wall we built twice than one we built once wrong." He was quiet. She could see him working through the math. 2 more days, the corner, the supplies they'd need to repack the clay, whether any of it would dry before the first hard freeze, and she knew none of the numbers were comfortable. "I hate that we have to redo it," he said finally. "I know." She picked up the pry bar they'd been using. "I hate it too. Now help me take it apart." They worked until dark that day and started again at first light. Hazel's shoulders ached from the 2nd hour onward, and she stopped noticing it sometime around the 4th, which wasn't the same as it stopping but was a reasonable substitute. Silas's blisters from the early pickaxe work had healed into calluses, and he worked with a grim efficiency that she recognized as the form his determination took when he was tired and frustrated and refusing to let either of those things make decisions. By Thursday morning, the corner was rebuilt. The clay was fresh and needed more time than they had to cure fully, but it was solid, and when Hazel pressed her hand to it, there was no give, no hollow sound. Just stone and clay and work done correctly. Fenner arrived exactly when he said he would, driving a small cart pulled by a mule that looked as no-nonsense as its owner. He climbed down without ceremony and walked directly to the smokehouse without being invited, which Hazel took as a good sign. A man who needed the tour first wasn't a man who already knew what he was looking at. He was in there for a long time, long enough that Silas twice started to go in, and Hazel touched his arm, and he stopped. She understood something about men like August Fenner. You didn't hover. You let them think. Hovering told them you were anxious, and anxious people were asking for reassurance rather than assessment, and he wasn't in the business of reassurance. When he came out, he walked the outside perimeter first. He looked at the vent opening. He crouched and looked at the foundation. He stood back and looked at the whole structure. He didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. The northeast corner, he said finally. Hazel felt something go tight in her chest. You rebuilt it, he said. Not a question. Yes. When? Tuesday, after I found the problem. He looked at her steadily. What made you check? I run my hand along the wall every few days, looking for give. Something moved in his face again, that almost smile. The vent's too high, he said. You need to drop it 4 inches. Right now it'll draw too strong in a cold wind, and you'll burn your fuel faster than you want, and the smoke will come through uneven. He held up 2 fingers. 4 inches. Not 3, not 5. How do we... You take out the top course of the vent frame and reset it. 2 hours of work if you know what you're doing. He looked at the vent again. I'll show you. That was unexpected. Hazel hadn't asked him to stay. He'd volunteered it. We appreciate... Silas started. I'm not doing you a favor, Fenner said, a little sharply. I don't like seeing it done wrong when it's this close to being right. He was already moving toward the vent structure. Get your tools. They spent the better part of that afternoon working alongside August Fenner. He didn't chat. He gave instructions in the specific, minimal way of someone who'd stopped being patient with imprecision decades ago, and Hazel followed them exactly, which seemed to satisfy him. Silas watched and learned and passed tools and didn't ask questions he could answer himself by watching. When the vent was reset, Fenner had them build a small fire inside, just scraps and kindling, and the 3 of them stood and watched the smoke move. It moved differently from how it would have moved at the original height. Slower, more even, less rushed. It filled the chamber before it rose, the way smoke needed to fill the chamber to do its work. Fenner watched it for several minutes. That's right, he said finally. The highest praise they were apparently going to get. He stayed for supper. That also hadn't been planned. Hazel had nothing prepared for 3 people and no reasonable time to prepare it. But she worked fast and without comment, pulling together what they had. Dried beans she'd set to soak that morning by habit, cornbread from flour that was getting low, the last of the late-season squash from their meager garden that had somehow survived both the blight and the early cold. It wasn't a meal anyone would have bragged about. It was food. It was enough. Fenner ate steadily and without performance, and then sat for a while with his coffee, looking at nothing in particular the way people do when they're comfortable enough in a place to stop being on guard. How long have you had the blind pigs? He asked, not making conversation exactly, more like gathering information for his own purposes. Almost 6 weeks, Hazel said, and before that they were at the Hatch feed store. Since August. He made a sound that wasn't quite disgust but was in the neighborhood. Grover Hatch doesn't know what he has in front of him, even when it's standing on his foot. He lifted his coffee. Blind pigs, raised right, can get to a weight you won't get from a regular commercial operation. They don't waste energy on anxiety. If you feed them smart and give them space and time... He stopped, looked at Hazel. You've already figured some of this out. Some of it, she agreed. What's your feeding regimen? She told him, the cracked corn, the dried clover, the fallen apples she'd been gathering from the 2 old trees at the north end of the property, the timing, the consistency. She told him about the notebook, the behavioral observations, the way she'd reorganized the pen. He listened the way someone listens when they're checking information against something they already know, updating internally as each piece lands. The clover's good, he said. Add dried apple to the feed itself, not just fresh apple on the side, dried and crushed into the mix. It affects the flesh. He paused. The result is subtle, but if you're going to cure this meat and sell it, subtle is what they'll pay for. Hazel looked at him. You've done this before, with blind pigs specifically. Twice, he said. Years ago. In Missouri. He looked down at his coffee. People thought I was foolish then, too. The silence that followed had the quality of a door left slightly open. What happened? Silas asked. Fenner was quiet for a moment. Made the finest smoked pork that County had seen in 20 years. He took a long drink of coffee. Sold it for 3 seasons. Then my wife got sick and we moved west looking for a drier climate, and I never went back to it. He said it with the flatness of a man who'd carried something for a long time and learned not to let it out at the wrong moments. Hazel didn't push on it. She just noted it, the way she noted everything, carefully and with respect for what it meant. But it worked, she said quietly. It worked. He set down his cup. That's why I came when you asked, because it can work, if you do it right. He looked at her directly. And I think you'll do it right. After Fenner left that evening, Silas washed the dishes and Hazel sat at the table with her notebook open, adding everything Fenner had told her to the back pages alongside her pig observations and her construction notes and the small pencil sketches she'd been making of the vent configurations. Silas came and stood behind her and looked at the pages over her shoulder. When did you start all this? He said. Day 1, she said. Day 1 of the pigs? Day 1 of the smokehouse planning. The pig notes started before that. He leaned down, putting his hands on the back of the chair, and looked at the pages more carefully. She could feel him taking it in, the density of it, the accumulation of weeks of thinking and watching and adjusting, all of it collected in the back of a flour sack notebook that had started out tracking grocery expenditures. Hazel, he said, what do you think this becomes, if it goes right? She thought about it. She didn't answer quickly because the question deserved a real answer and not an optimistic one. I think it becomes something the Valley hasn't seen before, she said finally. Not a big operation. We don't have the land or the capital for that, and I'm not sure I'd want it if we did. But something specific, something particular. She touched the edge of the notebook. If we control the whole process from feeding to curing, if we take the time that other people won't take, we can produce something that nobody else is producing. And something that nobody else is producing, that people want, is worth real money, Silas said. Is worth real money, she agreed. He was quiet. The fire had burned down to red coals, and the kitchen was warm and slightly dim. And outside the wind was moving, and somewhere in the pen the pigs were settled for the night. And for the first time in months, Hazel felt something she didn't want to name too early because naming things prematurely was how you cursed them. She settled for noticing it and moving on. Dried apples, she said, making a note. Into the feed directly, not just fresh on the side. She underlined it twice. I want to start that this week. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he went and banked the fire, and she stayed at the table a while longer, writing in the notebook by the last of the lamplight, and the house was quiet enough that she could hear the wind and the pigs and her own pencil on the paper, all of it mixed together into something that felt, at least tonight, very much like the sound of something building. It was a Friday in the 3rd week of October when Grover Hatch came. Not Martivos, not Ed Purdy speaking through an intermediary. Grover Hatch himself, in his wagon with the feed store signage on the side, driving up the lane in the late afternoon when the light was already going orange and thin. Hazel saw him coming from the pig pen and stayed where she was. She had been measuring the pigs' progress, running her hands along their backs and sides, checking weight distribution, a technique she'd read about in a pamphlet from a livestock association she'd written away for in August. She finished what she was doing before she went to the gate. By then Grover was out of his wagon and standing in the yard looking at the smokehouse. He'd never seen it before. From the expression on his face, he was recalibrating something. Hazel, he said, without taking his eyes off the structure. Grover, she said. Now he looked at her. Grover Hatch was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the permanent look of someone who'd been proven right often enough to have developed strong opinions about his own judgment. He had small blue eyes that moved quickly and a way of presenting himself that suggested he expected to be listened to, which in Calder County he usually was. That's a real building, he said, with what sounded like grudging surprise. It is, she said. You two built it. We did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the pen and at the 3 pigs, with an assessment that she recognized as professional rather than merely curious. He'd worked around livestock his whole life. He knew what healthy animals looked like. They're doing well, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't expected. Not respect exactly, something earlier than respect. A beginning. They are, she said. He turned back to her. Hazel, I want to say... He stopped. worked his jaw slightly. I want to say that I may have been... He stopped again, evidently finding the words more difficult than he'd anticipated. What I said in town, in front of people, that wasn't called for. She looked at him without helping him along. I'm telling you that directly, he said, because I think you deserve to hear it directly. He cleared his throat. Silas made a decision I didn't understand, and I made fun of it publicly. It was wrong of me. The apology sat between them in the cold air. It was not a complete one. It didn't cover the way his eyes had moved over her when he'd knocked the bill of sale out of Silas's hand. It didn't cover the months of commentary he'd circulated through the valley's gossip channels, the variations on Gone by December that had traveled back to her through Clara Purdy and others. It didn't cover the particular cruelty of public humiliation in a community small enough that there was no escaping the echo of it. But it was something, and she understood that for a man like Grover Hatch, something was the whole of what he had. I appreciate you saying it, she said. He nodded, looked at the smokehouse one more time. When you're ready to market, you'll need buyers. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I know people in Cheyenne, merchants, hotels. He paused. I'm not saying you need my help. I'm saying it's there if you want it. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. I'll remember that, she said. He drove away, and she stood in the yard and watched until the wagon was around the bend and gone, and then she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding longer than she'd realized. She went back to the pigs. The black and white one, the boldest, turned at the sound of the gate and came toward her along its memorized path with the particular unhurried confidence of an animal that had learned its world well. She put her hand down and let it find her. 3 months ago, Grover Hatch had announced to a crowd of people that this animal was worthless. She stood in the gathering dusk, feeling the pig's snout against her palm, and thought about what worthless meant, and who got to decide it, and how much of the world's judgment was delivered by people who'd simply stopped looking. The first real frost was coming. She could feel it in the air, that particular sharpened edge that meant business. The smokehouse was built. The pigs were growing. The hickory was stacked in the barn, dry and waiting. They weren't safe yet. They weren't close to safe. There was still so much that could go wrong, and she was still adding to the list in the back of her notebook, the one that started risks and had gotten longer before it started getting shorter. But for the first time since Silas had come home with 3 blind pigs and $14 and fear all over his face, Hazel Rowan stood in her own yard and felt that the ground beneath her feet was something she had helped make solid. She latched the pen gate, counted the pigs by sound and presence the way she'd learned to count them, and walked back toward the house where the lamp was already lit and supper needed starting, and the notebook waited on the table, and there was still more to plan. The dried apple went into the feed mix on a Monday, and by Wednesday Hazel was already watching for differences she knew were too early to see. That was the thing about caring deeply about an outcome. It made you look for evidence before evidence was available, and then you had to discipline yourself away from the looking, or you'd drive yourself half mad with interpretation. She caught herself crouching at the pen fence on Wednesday afternoon, studying the gray pig's coat in the thin autumn light, and recognized what she was doing, and made herself stand up and go back to the house. You're watching them too much, Silas said that evening. I know, she said. You watched them plenty before. This is different. This is watching because I'm nervous, not because I'm learning. She set down her fork. There's a difference. He looked at her for a moment. Since when are you nervous? It was a real question, not a dismissive one. He genuinely wanted to know. Since Fenner told us it can work, she said. Before that I could be calm because there was nothing certain either way. Now there's a direction, and direction means there's something specific to lose. He was quiet, turning that over. That's a strange thing to say. It's a strange thing to feel, she agreed. But there it is. What she didn't say, because she wasn't entirely sure how to put it in words yet, was that the visit from Grover Hatch had changed something in the atmosphere of the valley in a way that felt less like relief and more like pressure. An apology from Grover Hatch was not a quiet thing. People noticed when Grover changed position on something, the way they noticed a weather vane swinging around, because it told them which direction the wind was now coming from. And when people noticed that Grover had driven out to the Rowan homestead and come back without buying anything or arguing about anything, the conversation in Delridge shifted its shape slightly. Not to support, not yet, and maybe not ever in any full sense, but to something more watchful. The valley was paying attention, and being watched was its own kind of weight to carry. November arrived without ceremony. The first real snow came on a Tuesday, not the suggestive dusting they'd had in late October, but a serious 4-inch snow that settled over everything and turned the valley into the particular kind of silence that Hazel had never fully made her peace with. She'd grown up with Illinois winters, which were harsh in their own way, but this was different. This silence had teeth. It meant that whatever you hadn't finished, whatever preparations you hadn't completed, were now going to cost you more to complete or simply couldn't be done at all. The smokehouse was finished. That much was certain, and she let herself feel that certainty all the way through on the morning. She walked out in the snow and put her hand on the outside wall and felt the solid cold of the limestone beneath her palm. 8 weeks of work. A torn-out corner and a rebuilt one. A vent adjusted 4 inches at the instruction of a half-deaf old man who'd once made the finest smoked pork in Missouri and then carried the loss of it westward for years. The door fit true. The interior smelled of new clay and wood and the particular mineral sharpness of limestone, and underneath that, already, the ghost of hickory smoke from the test fires they'd built. She stood inside the empty smokehouse for several minutes before she went to see to the pigs. The pigs, those 3 particular animals who had become in some ways more familiar to her than most of the people in Delridge, were managing the cold with a composure that still surprised her sometimes. They pressed together in the corner of the pen she'd lined with extra straw, the gray one in the middle, flanked by the pink and the black and white. And they were warm, and as best she could assess, well. The black and white one lifted its head when she arrived, and made the low sound she'd come to think of as its specific greeting for her, distinct from the sound it made for Silas, and different again from the sound it made when it smelled food before anyone was present. She'd written that down in the notebook months ago. They distinguish between people and purposes by smell alone. Each recognition sounds different. She still thought that was remarkable. She didn't say that to anyone, because it sounded like the kind of observation that would get her called fanciful by the wrong people. But she thought it privately and often. It was Ed Purdy who started it, not maliciously. That was the thing about Ed Purdy. He wasn't a man who set out to cause trouble. He simply talked, constantly, to everyone, with the unfiltered generosity of a person who'd never learned to consider the second-order effects of sharing information. He talked because silence made him uncomfortable, and other people made him curious, and he'd spent 50 years conflating the two. What he told people, starting somewhere in the first week of November, was this. The Rowans were almost ready to slaughter. He didn't know when, but soon. And from what he'd heard, those pigs had come up significantly from where they'd started. And Grover himself, mind you, had said something privately to Ed that amounted to, if not an endorsement, at least an absence of the mockery he'd been trafficking in all fall. This was enough. By the second week of November, Hazel had received 3 separate visits from neighbors she hadn't spoken to since the summer, people who'd been part of the laughing crowd or adjacent to it, who now appeared on the lane with various stated purposes. A borrowed tool to return, a question about the South Creek easement, a basket of late garden produce that Hazel accepted with genuine gratitude because they were low on vegetables and she wasn't going to let pride interfere with food. Each of these visits had a secondary layer. Each person, at some point, found a way to look at the smokehouse or ask about the pigs, or make some comment that was an indirect version of, "We're watching and we're updating our position, and we'd like to be on the right side of this when it resolves." Hazel understood the subtext. She didn't resent it. What she did was remember it, with precision, in the way she remembered everything, as information about character, filed carefully and without judgment, available for later use. What bothered her more, not greatly, but genuinely, was the pressure it created around the timing, because the timing was still hers and Silas's to determine, and she was becoming increasingly aware that the valley had formed an expectation about when that would be. An expectation was a different thing than faith. Faith was what you had in people you trusted. Expectation was what you had in a performance you'd bought a ticket for and wanted delivered on schedule. She was not a performance. Neither were the pigs. It was Silas who first said what they were both thinking. He came in from the barn on a Thursday evening in the second week of November with snow on his coat, and a particular expression she recognized as the one he wore when he'd been alone long enough to arrive at a conclusion he wasn't sure she'd agree with. He took his coat off, hung it up, sat down at the table. "I've been thinking about the timing," he said. I know you have, she said. She was at the stove, not looking at him. The pigs are good now. They're at a good weight. If we wait another 3-4 weeks, we risk what? She turned around now. He opened his hand. Cold getting worse. One of them getting sick. Any number of things. He paused. And we have people waiting. We don't owe people a schedule, she said. No, but we could use the money, he said. Hazel, we could use it now. That landed, because it was true. Their reserves were not gone. She'd managed the household too carefully for them to be gone. But they were thin in a way that the coming winter was going to test further. More feed for the pigs through the cure and sale process. Heat. Food for themselves. $14 had stretched further than it had any right to, but it had not stretched infinitely, and the math was presenting itself with increasing bluntness. She came and sat across from him. Tell me what you think we should do, she said. He looked at her, aware that this was a test of sorts, not a cruel one, but a real one. She was asking him to commit to a position rather than float a concern, and he understood the difference. I think we should slaughter in the next week, he said. Start the cure before the end of November. Try to have finished product by Christmas. He held her gaze. I know that's earlier than you planned. It's 4 weeks earlier than I planned, she said. I know. She was quiet. She looked at the table, then at the window, then at her hands. Here was what she knew. The animals were healthy. They were at a good weight. But they were not at the weight they would be in 4 more weeks, fed consistently through the rest of November, allowed to put on the last of what they would put on before slaughter. The difference between where they were now and where they would be in 4 weeks was not dramatic. It wasn't the difference between failure and success, but it was the difference between good and exceptional. It was the difference between a product that was better than what the valley was used to and a product that would make someone who tasted it stop and put the fork down and say, "Where did you get this?" That distinction mattered to her in a way she found difficult to explain without sounding precious. She also knew that Silas was right about the money. And she knew that Silas was right about the risk. Every week of delay was a week in which something could go wrong, and winter in Wyoming territory had a long tradition of things going wrong. Not next week, she said. He started to speak. Hear me out. She leaned forward. Not next week, but I'll give you a date. 3 weeks from Thursday, that's the 15th. She met his eyes. 3 weeks, and we do this right. And between now and then, we don't let outside pressure make a single decision for us. Not the money pressure, not the neighbor pressure, not Grover Hatch's contacts in Cheyenne. She paused. 3 weeks. He sat with it. She could see him calculating. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she said. And in those 3 weeks, I need you to trust me completely. Not mostly, completely. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there in a while. Not the belief that had returned when they stood at the pig pen in October, which was warm and tentative. This was something drier and more specific. It was the look of a man making a conscious decision to bet on a particular person with full knowledge of the stakes. All right, he said. All right, she said, and went back to the stove. The pressure came from an unexpected direction 4 days later. Hazel had ridden into Del Ridge alone for the 3rd time in as many weeks, this time specifically to purchase salt in a quantity that would make the cure work correctly. Not the small household amounts she'd been buying to stretch the budget, real curing quantities, which required a real expenditure and a deliberate conversation with Donahue about the order. She was settling the account at the counter when Grover Hatch came through the door. He saw her immediately. He didn't seem surprised. The town was small enough that neither of them should have been surprised to see the other anywhere, but there was something in the way he came to stand near the counter that was less casual than it looked. Hazel, he said, I was hoping to run into you. She waited. I've had some communication from a contact in Cheyenne, he said, a man named Whitmore. He runs provisioning for 2 hotels and a restaurant, been doing it for 12 years. He knows his product. He set his hands on the counter in a way that suggested he was trying to appear relaxed rather than actually being relaxed. He's interested. He's willing to come out and look at what you have once it's ready. That's good to know, she said. He's got a window. He does his purchasing for the Christmas season in the first week of December. Grover paused. Which means if you want to get product to him in time for Christmas placement, we'd need to be ready before then, she said. Yes. She looked at him. We're not going to be ready before then. Grover's face moved through something. Hazel? We're going to be ready when we're ready, she said. She kept her voice even. If Mr. Whitmore has a January window, we'll talk to him in January. If he doesn't, we'll find another buyer. She held Grover's gaze. I'm not rushing this. Grover looked at her for a long moment. He pressed his lips together in a way that contained something he'd decided not to say. Then, you understand that Christmas placement means a premium price. Hotels want specialty product for the holiday. They'll pay… Grover. She said his name gently, the way you said the name of someone you were asking to stop. I know what you're trying to do, and I understand that it comes from somewhere reasonable, but the answer is still no. She picked up the salt she'd purchased. If the smokehouse produces what I think it's going to produce, we won't have any trouble finding buyers, at a fair price, without panic. She was out the door before he could find another angle. On the street, walking back to her wagon, she made herself breathe slowly. Her heart was doing something it didn't need to be doing, and she was aware that the physical response was betraying more anxiety than she wanted to feel. She'd made the right call. She was almost certain she'd made the right call. She put the salt in the wagon and sat with her hands on the reins for a moment before she clicked the horse forward. Almost certain was going to have to be enough. The argument happened on a Sunday. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a large argument in the sense of raised voices and slammed doors. Those weren't really in either of their repertoires, which meant that when they did argue, it in some ways was harder to navigate. It started over breakfast, with Silas mentioning what Clara Purdy had told him at the feed store, that there was a buyer coming through from Fort Laramie who'd expressed interest in whole live animals, and Hazel saying no. Just no? He said. We're not selling them live, she said. We've been through this. Clara said, I know what Clara said. She put down her coffee. Silas, if we sell them live, we lose control of everything we've built. The cure, the quality, the result. We hand someone else what we've spent 3 months creating, and we take the base price and we watch someone else's name get attached to the end product. She paused. That's not what we agreed to. We didn't agree to watch our reserves run out either, he said. Hazel, I'm not arguing with your plan. I'm saying the plan's getting tight. I know it's tight. Do you? He looked at her directly. Because you say that, but then you turn down Whitmore, and now you're turning down this buyer from Fort Laramie. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like you might be… He stopped. Finish it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. It looks like you might be more attached to being right than to us surviving the winter. The silence that followed had weight to it. She picked up her coffee cup, set it down again. She was doing the thing she did when she was genuinely angry, which was speak very little and move very slowly, because her instinct when angry was to say too much too precisely, and she'd learned that precision in anger left damage that took longer to repair than the argument was worth. That's not fair, she said finally. I know, he said, and he sounded like he meant it, not as a capitulation but as an honest admission. I know it's not fair. I'm scared, Hazel, that's all. I'm scared, and I said it wrong. She looked at him. He looked back. He had the expression of a man who'd put something down on the table and didn't know if it would be used against him. We are not selling them live, she said, and we are not rushing the cure because someone has a purchasing window, and we are going to be fine. She paused. I need you to hold those 3 things simultaneously. That's a lot to hold, he said. I know, she said. I'm holding them too. He looked at his hands. Then, I'm sorry for what I said. I know you are. She looked at him steadily. The 3 weeks holds. I need those 3 weeks, Silas. If I'm wrong, and we'll deal with it. But I need you to let me be right. He nodded slowly. It cost him something, that nod. She could see it. And she understood that what it cost him, the setting aside of his fear, the decision to follow her instinct over his own dread, was not nothing. It was, in fact, one of the more significant things he'd ever done for her, and she didn't take it lightly. The slaughter happened on a Thursday, as Hazel had set. It was the 15th of November, gray and cold with a wind from the north that cut through wool like it had a personal grievance. Silas had done this kind of work before, years ago on his father's farm, and he was competent and quick. Hazel was steady beside him in the way she was steady beside him at everything. Not performing steadiness, actually having it, which was different and rarer. She'd spent the previous day in the pen with the pigs in a way she hadn't since the early weeks, not doing anything specific, just present. The black and white one found her hand twice. She let it. She didn't dress it up into something it wasn't. She wasn't sentimental in ways that made her impractical. But she was also not going to pretend that 3 months of daily presence, 3 months of careful attention to 3 particular animals, added up to nothing. It added up to something. She put it where it belonged and kept it there. The carcasses were better than she'd dared calculate. Silas said nothing for a full minute after he'd properly assessed them, and in the silence, Hazel took her own measure and felt something cold and factual settle into certainty. The weight was there. The fat distribution was right, even without the irregular pocketing you got from stress and irregular feeding. The flesh was firm and correctly colored, nothing she'd call a defect, nothing she'd call a compromise. Hazel, Silas said. I see it, she said. These are... He didn't finish because he was not a man given to hyperbole, and he couldn't find the accurate word that wasn't hyperbolic. Good, she said. They're genuinely good, good. She didn't say, I told you so. She didn't say, this is why 3 weeks mattered. She didn't say any of the things she'd stored up over the past month because they didn't need saying, and Silas already knew them, and the animals in front of them were a more eloquent argument than anything she could manage in language. She went inside to her notebook and wrote the date and the result in careful, specific terms. Then she closed the notebook and started on the brine. The curing brine was a thing she'd been developing privately since August Fenner's visit, built from his principles and her own additions. She had a salt base, which was standard. She'd added dried apple to the mix, taking Fenner's advice about the dried apple in the feed and extending it into the cure itself. Her own extrapolation, untested, which was either insight or hubris, and she wouldn't know which until it was done. She'd added dried clover and a small amount of something she'd found in the last issue of a farming periodical she subscribed to, a mention of sugar in the cure producing a particular result in the texture of the finished meat. She had very little sugar, she used all of it. She also added something she hadn't told Silas about yet, because she hadn't been sure until she was standing in the smokehouse with the brine ready and the first ham in front of her. She added hickory smoked salt. She'd made it herself, over the previous 2 weeks, by hanging coarse salt in the smokehouse during the test fires. It was an extra step that added time, and no one had told her to do it. She'd thought of it herself, in the middle of the night, lying in the dark while the doubt asked its questions, and she'd thought, what if the smoke isn't just external? What if you could build it into the cure itself? What if the flavor came from inside the meat and outside simultaneously, meeting in the middle? She'd made the salt because she couldn't sleep until she'd decided to try it. She packed the first ham in the brine mixture with hands that were red from the cold and steady from something that wasn't calm exactly, but was related to it. And she thought, this either works or it doesn't. You'll know in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She lowered the lid on the curing vessel and pressed it down firmly and went to start on the next one. 2 weeks into the cure, August Fenner came back without being invited. He appeared on a Wednesday morning, same mule, same cart, same economy of movement. Silas was in the field and Hazel was in the barn when she heard the mule and came out to find Fenner standing in the yard, looking at the smokehouse the way a man looks at a building he's been thinking about since the last time he saw it. I didn't know you were coming, she said. Didn't know I was either until this morning, he said. He turned and looked at her. How's the cure going? 2 weeks in, no problems I can see. What's your brine? She told him. All of it, including the hickory smoked salt. She watched his face when she got to that part. He was very still for a moment. That's your own idea, he said. Yes. Where'd you get it? I was thinking about smoke penetration, about how deep it gets, and I thought... She paused. I thought, what if it came from both directions? He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them and the mule shifted its weight, and somewhere in the barn a board creaked. In 37 years of curing meat, Fenner said, I have never met anyone who used hickory smoked salt in the brine. Her chest tightened. Is that because it won't work? It's because nobody thought of it. He looked at the smokehouse. It might not work. There are things it might do to the texture I can't predict, but... He stopped himself. Show me the vessels. She took him into the smokehouse, which was cold and dim and smelled of the brine's particular salt-sweet smoke layering. He looked at the vessels. He lifted a lid and leaned down and breathed the smell. He stood back up. He had the expression of someone running calculations they couldn't show their work on. "It might work," he said. "It might work better than you know." She wasn't sure, standing in the cold smokehouse beside a taciturn old man who'd once made the best smoked pork in Missouri, whether she should feel vindicated or terrified. She felt both, in roughly equal measure, and let that be what it was. What happened next was something Hazel hadn't anticipated, which was that Fenner started coming regularly. Not every week, but every 10 days or so, he would appear in the yard with his mule and his silence and his 37 years of expertise, and he would look at the smokehouse and ask her questions about the cure, and sometimes offer observations that she wrote down immediately, and sometimes simply stand and think in a way she'd learned not to interrupt. He never announced these visits in advance, and she never asked him to because asking would have made it formal, and something about formality would have changed whatever it was that made him come. She understood that he was lonely. She understood this not because he said anything about it, but because of what he talked about on the evenings he stayed for supper, which was the Missouri operation, the wife he'd followed westward, the product he'd made that nobody in Wyoming had ever tasted or ever would. He talked about those things in the way people talked about the period of their life when they were most themselves, and she understood that what he saw in the Rowan smokehouse was something that pulled at a memory of purpose. She never said that to him. It would have embarrassed him and probably insulted him, and besides, it was the kind of observation that was better honored by action than articulation. What she did instead was keep doing the work, and keep asking the right questions, and make sure there was enough food when he came in the evening. These were the things she knew how to do. 3 weeks into the cure, on a cold December morning with snow coming down in that steady, unremarkable way that meant it intended to be there for a while, Rolf Voss came out. Not Marta this time, Rolf himself. He came around the side of the house to where Hazel was stacking the last of the hickory in the lean-to beside the smokehouse, making sure it stayed dry, and he stood watching her for a moment before he spoke. "Hazel," he said. "Rolf." He looked at the smokehouse. He looked at it the same way Grover had, the same way Fenner had the first time. That recalibration, that updating of the initial estimate. She was beginning to recognize that particular look. It meant, "I did not expect this." "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know I'm not... This isn't about trying to get into your business." She waited. "My wife told me about the conversation she had with you in September," he said, "when she offered you $30 for the pigs." He paused. "She said you turned her down without hesitating." "That's right. I want to ask why, not to argue about it. I just..." He looked at the smokehouse again, then back at her. "I want to understand what you saw that we didn't." It was, she thought, the most honest question anyone in the valley had asked her since this started. Not a veiled pitch, not a courtesy call, not an apology for his own purposes. A genuine question from a man who was trying to understand something he'd missed. She considered it seriously. "I didn't see anything you couldn't have seen," she said. "I just didn't see what Grover saw. Grover looked at those animals and saw what they couldn't do. I looked at them and thought about what they already were doing." She picked up a piece of hickory, turned it over in her hands. They'd been in a strange pen for 2 months in the dark, and they weren't panicking. They were navigating. That's not a small thing, in an animal or a person. Rolf looked at her. He nodded, slowly, with the look of someone who'd received an answer that was going to take time to fully absorb. "I've been in this valley 9 years," he said. "I've watched a lot of families come through." "I know," she said. We didn't give you and Silas a fair look." He said it plainly. "I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that, Rolf." "Whatever you need for the next stage," he said. "Equipment, labor, a reference to buyers I know, you ask." He held her gaze. "I mean it." She nodded. He nodded. He walked back to his horse and rode out, and Hazel stood with a piece of hickory in her hands and the snow coming down around the smokehouse, and thought about the odd, roundabout way that credibility sometimes arrived. Not in a straight line, not when you first deserved it, but sideways. After enough time had passed, and enough work had been done, and enough people had updated their positions that the cumulative weight of it eventually arrived at your door. She didn't warm herself with it too long. There was hickory to stack, and the cure had 3 more weeks to run, and December was settling in with serious intent around the valley, and there was still so much that could go wrong. She put the hickory in the lean-to and went back to work. On a Tuesday night in the 4th week of the cure, Hazel woke at 2 in the morning with her heart going too fast. She lay still in the dark and let her mind catch up to her body. No sound from outside that shouldn't be there. Silas breathing steadily beside her. The fire still holding in the stove, she could feel the faint warmth of it. Nothing wrong that she could identify. But something had pulled her awake, and she'd learned over the years that her mind sometimes knew things before the rest of her did, and that waking at 2 in the morning was occasionally her own internal system trying to get her attention. She got up without waking Silas. She put on her coat and boots and went outside into the cold, lantern in hand, and walked to the smokehouse. She went inside and held the lamp up and looked at the curing vessels in the low amber light. She looked at them for a long time. Then she lifted the lid on the first one and bent close and breathed. The smell was different from 3 weeks ago. It had deepened, the way sound deepened in a large room when more voices joined it. The salt was still present, but underneath it something had developed. A richness, a complexity, the early signature of a transformation that was happening slowly enough that you could miss it day to day but not week to week. The hickory smoked salt had done something to the brine itself. She could smell it, something she couldn't name exactly, but that made her think of the word depth. The way you said it about music, about character, about wells. She stood in the smokehouse in the cold and the dark with the lamp held up and her breath coming in small clouds, and she thought, it's working, not finished, not there yet, but working in the specific way she'd hoped it might and hadn't let herself believe until this moment. She lowered the lid back down, pressed it, checked the second vessel, then the third. Then she went back inside, took off her boots, hung up her coat, and got back into bed. You all right? Silas said, not fully awake. Yes, she said. What were you doing? She lay back and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Checking on things, she said. Go back to sleep. He did. She lay awake for a while longer, not from anxiety this time, but from the particular quality of alertness that came when you'd been waiting a long time for something to announce itself, and it finally had. The valley was quiet outside. The snow had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, nothing. Just cold and dark, and the faint smell of hickory that had worked its way into her coat and her hair and the fabric of everything they'd been building toward since September. She closed her eyes. She thought about 3 pigs in a feed store pen, turning their heads toward sounds, navigating by smell, not panicking. She thought about what they'd become. She thought about what was hanging in those vessels in the dark, slowly, without rushing, becoming something that had never existed in Calder County before, and might not exist again unless you took the time and held the line and refused every single shortcut that the scared part of you wanted to take. She let herself, quietly, and without announcing it to anyone, feel proud. Then she let herself sleep. 6 weeks after Hazel had pressed the lid down on those curing vessels and told herself not to think about them every hour of every day, a promise she kept approximately 40% of the time, the smoking began. It started on a Monday in late December, when the valley was locked in the particular stillness that deep winter imposed on everything. The temperature had dropped sharply over the previous week, and the creek had frozen along its edges, and the fields were buried under a foot of snow that nobody was going to move until March. There was no travel that didn't have a reason behind it, and most people in Calder County were doing exactly what winter in Wyoming territory required, which was staying close to home and burning through the wood they'd had the sense to put up in October. Silas built the first hickory fire in the smokehouse at dawn. Hazel stood in the doorway and watched the smoke begin to move, and she watched it the way Fenner had taught her to watch it. Not at the fire, at the smoke, the way it filled the lower chamber before it rose, the way it moved toward the vent with the particular unhurried patience they'd adjusted for on that Thursday afternoon in October, when Fenner had crouched and looked and said 4 inches, not 3, not 5. The smoke moved right. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took to confirm it, and then she went back inside to start breakfast because the smoking was going to take the better part of 3 weeks, and feeling good about the first hour of it was a long way from feeling good about the result. Silas came in 10 minutes later with hickory smoke already in his coat and sat down at the table. It's drawing right, he said. I know, she said. You looked pleased. I looked relieved, she said. Different thing. He smiled, the particular smile she recognized as his honest one rather than his polite one. What's the difference? Pleased is when something good happens. Relieved is when something bad doesn't. She put coffee in front of him. We haven't earned pleased yet. When do we earn it? She thought about it. January, she said. Maybe. Fenner came on the third day of smoking without being asked, the same as he'd been doing for the past month and a half. Appearing when his instincts apparently told him to appear, bringing his mule and his silence and his 37 years of knowing what smoke was supposed to be doing at every stage of a cure. He went directly to the smokehouse. Hazel gave him time. When she came out 20 minutes later, he was standing in the yard looking at the vent, watching the smoke come out of it with the focused attention of a man reading text in a language he'd spent decades mastering. "How's it look?" she asked. "Even," he said. "Better than even. You're managing the feed rate right." Silas has been on it every 2 hours. Fenner glanced at the barn where Silas was presently cutting fresh hickory to size. "He's more careful than I expected," he said. It wasn't an insult to the expectation. It was an honest update. "He's been like that since September," Hazel said. "Once he commits to something, he commits completely." Fenner was quiet for a moment. The smoked salt in the brine. He said it as though returning to a thought he'd put down weeks ago and just picked back up. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" "And I think what you've done, if it comes out the way I think it's going to come out, is something I can't put a name to yet." He looked at the vent smoke again. "There's a French word. They use it for wine, for cheese, for the way a place and a process come together into something that can't be made anywhere else the same way." He paused. "I don't know that word." "Terroir," she said. He looked at her. "I read," she said. Something in his face settled into a kind of deep, uncomplicated satisfaction. "Yes," he said, "that's it. What you've built here, this particular combination, the animals, the feed, the brine, that salt, nobody else has this. You can describe every element and someone else can try it, and it won't be the same because they didn't arrive at it the way you did." He turned away from the vent. "That's worth understanding." She understood it. She'd been thinking about it in slightly different language for weeks, lying awake in the small hours when the doubt had temporarily receded and left room for something cleaner. What she'd built wasn't replicable in the way a recipe was replicable, because the recipe was only the surface of it. Underneath was 3 months of observation and adjustment and refusal and a corner torn out and rebuilt, an event dropped 4 inches, and a nighttime idea about smoke in a brine that might have gone wrong and didn't. The process was the product. "Stay for supper," she said. "I'll stay," he said. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They had enough food, which was its own kind of gift given where they'd been in September. Hazel made a meal that was better than it had any right to be given the ingredients available. And Silas found somewhere, she didn't ask exactly where, a small piece of ribbon she'd mentioned admiring on a bolt of fabric in Donahue's store back in October, and he'd tied it around a jar of preserved pears and set it on the table on Christmas morning, and she'd looked at it for a long moment before she said anything. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember things," he said. He was a little defensive about it, which made her smile. "I know you do," she said. "I just don't always give you credit for it." He looked at her. "That might be the first time you've ever admitted that." "Don't let it go to your head." She picked up the jar. "Thank you." It was a small exchange, the kind of thing that didn't mean much by itself, and meant everything in context. The context being 4 years of marriage and a hard fall and a winter that was still testing them, and the fact that he'd held on to a detail from October and done something with it. She put the ribbon on the shelf above the kitchen window where she could see it when she was working, and neither of them mentioned it again, which was also exactly right. The smoking finished on a Wednesday, 15 days after it started. Hazel had been in and out of the smokehouse every day, managing the fire in rotation with Silas, monitoring the color development and the surface texture the way Fenner had described to her, the way the exterior should look, feel, smell at each stage, the checkpoints that told you it was working, and the signs that would tell you if something had gone wrong. Nothing went wrong. She noted this with a careful gratitude that didn't extend to assumption, because something could still go wrong in the resting period, and she was not done being vigilant. The hams hung in the finished smokehouse in the cold air, and when she stood in there on that Wednesday evening after the last fire had burned down, she stood very still for a long time. The smell was extraordinary. She was not prone to overstatement, and she was aware that she was not an objective observer of this particular product, so she ran through those caveats before she let herself land on the word. But the smell was extraordinary. It was deep and layered in a way that most smoked meat wasn't, which was usually a single note, smoke, with the meat beneath it. This had layers she could move through mentally, the way you move through rooms. The hickory was present, but it wasn't dominant. Beneath it was something sweet that was the apple, she thought, both in the feed and in the brine. And beneath that, threaded through everything, was the smoked salt, her idea, the 2 a.m. idea, the one she'd lain awake making herself commit to. And it had done exactly what she'd hoped, which was to create a flavor that seemed to come from inside the meat and outside simultaneously, a continuity that she didn't know the precise word for, but understood perfectly in her mouth and chest. She stood there for several minutes. Then she closed the smokehouse door and went to find Silas. She found him in the barn. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face immediately, the way he'd gotten better at doing over the past 3 months. "Well," he said. "Come and smell," she said. He put down what he was doing and followed her. She opened the smokehouse door and stepped back and let him go in first. She watched him from the doorway. He went in and stood, and the smell reached him, and she could see it happen. The moment of impact, the way his posture changed slightly, the way he turned his head without meaning to, as if trying to locate something. He stood there for a long minute. "Hazel," he said. "I know," she said. "This is—" He turned and looked at her across the smokehouse. His face had the expression of a man who doubted something important and was now in the specific emotional position of having been wrong in the best possible way. "I didn't know it was going to be like this." "Neither did I," she said. "Not exactly. But you thought—" "I hoped," she said. "I thought it could be. I didn't know." She paused. "There's always a difference." He looked around the smokehouse at the hanging hams, at the work they'd built and stoked and tended for 15 cold December days, and then back at her. "What do we do now?" he said. "Now," she said, "we cut a sample, and we get August Fenner out here before anyone else." Fenner arrived 2 days later on a Friday morning with ice on the road and a sky the color of pewter that suggested it had more snow in mind for the afternoon. Hazel had cut the sample herself, a thin section from the first ham, and set it on the kitchen table on a clean cloth. She hadn't tasted it yet. She'd been saving it for this, for the assessment of someone whose judgment she trusted in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with 37 years of knowing exactly what smoked meat was supposed to be. Fenner came in and took off his coat and sat down at the table without ceremony. He looked at the sample. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, steadily, for longer than most people thought necessary, because he was actually looking, rather than just glancing. He picked up a piece. Hazel stood near the stove. Silas stood near the door. Neither of them moved. Fenner ate the sample slowly. He didn't make a sound. He didn't change expression. He sat for a moment after he'd finished, looking at the table. "Cut me another piece," he said. She did. He ate the second piece even more slowly. His eyes were focused on something nobody else in the room could see, which was the information arriving through taste and what decades of experience allowed him to do with it. He put his hands flat on the table. "The smoked salt changed the texture," he said. "The interior." He spoke carefully, choosing words the way you chose them when the thing you were describing was specific and you didn't want to settle for approximate. "There's a tenderness in the deep muscle that I don't— That's not what you normally get. Normally the cure works from the outside in, and the center is always a little different from the edge." He paused. "This doesn't have that difference. It's consistent all the way through." Hazel's hands were very still. "That's the smoked salt," she said. "That's your smoked salt," he said. "Nobody else's." He looked up at her. His eyes had an expression she hadn't seen there before, which was something she could only call respect. The uncomplicated kind that experts reserved for other people who'd done something the expert recognized as genuinely difficult and genuinely right. "I don't think I could have told you to do that. I don't think it would have occurred to me." Silas looked at Hazel. She was looking at Fenner. "What does that mean for the product?" she asked, because she needed to hear it from him in concrete terms, not in the emotional terms that were already pressing against the back of her own throat. "It means," Fenner said, that in 40 years I have tasted two things in this category that I would call exceptional. This is one of them. He picked up his coffee cup. The other was mine 20 years ago, in Missouri. The kitchen was very quiet. "You're telling me the truth," she said, not doubting him, asking him to confirm that he wasn't managing her toward confidence, that he was delivering an actual assessment from the part of himself that had no reason to be kind. "I haven't told you anything but the truth since the day you came to my door with that stew pot," he said. She sat down at the table, not because her legs were going out from under her, though they were in the neighborhood of that, because she needed to be at eye level with him for what she was about to say. "I need to know if it's consistent," she said. "If one ham is exceptional and the others are average, then we have one exceptional ham. I need to know if the process is consistent across all of them." "Then cut samples from two more," he said. She did. He tasted both. He took his time. He came back with the same assessment, adjusted for small natural variations. The pink pig's ham had a slightly firmer texture. The gray pig's had the deepest smoke penetration. The black and white one's was the sweetest at the finish, probably because that animal had eaten the most apple. Small differences. Nothing she'd call inconsistency. Everything she'd call character. "You have 6 exceptional hams," Fenner said, "and a method that nobody else in this territory has." What Hazel did next surprised Silas. She didn't contact Grover Hatch. She didn't reach out to the Whitmore contact in Cheyenne. She didn't move fast at all, which, given the weeks of pressure to move faster, he thought would be the first thing she did once the product was proven. Instead, she spent 2 days writing. She sat at the kitchen table with paper and her careful, precise handwriting, and she composed letters. Not to buyers first, to people whose opinion she trusted or whose position in the food trade gave them access she didn't have. She wrote to the provisioning manager at the largest hotel in Cheyenne, not Grover's contact, but one she'd found herself through the territorial business directory she'd borrowed from Clara Purdy's husband. She wrote to a man in Denver who ran a specialty food import business and whose name had appeared in a farming periodical she'd been reading for 3 years. She wrote to the restaurant owner in Laramie that August Fenner had mentioned once in passing, the one who'd been trying to source quality Wyoming products since he'd opened. She wrote each letter in careful, specific terms, not selling language, describing language, what the product was, how it had been made, what made it different, in precise terms that a professional in the food business could evaluate rather than a general public claim could inflate. She included in each letter a short paragraph from August Fenner, written by Fenner himself on a piece of paper she'd brought to his shack and waited while he composed, that said, "In 40 years of working with cured and smoked meat, I have encountered 2 products I would call exceptional, without reservation. The Rowan ham from Del Ridge, Wyoming territory, is one of them." She'd asked Fenner to write it, and he'd looked at her for a long moment and then taken the paper and written it without discussion, which was how she'd known it was the right ask. Silas read the letters before she sealed them. "This is different from what I expected you to do," he said. "I know. I expected you to contact Grover's Cheyenne man." "Whitmore's a hotel provisioner," she said. "That's one sale at a time, at their price, on their schedule. I want buyers who come to us." She looked at the sealed envelopes. "If what Fenner says is accurate, and I believe it is, then the product will make the argument. I just need to get it in front of the right people." She paused. "The right people are not the ones who are already looking for a supplier. The right people are the ones who didn't know they needed this until they tasted it." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you decide this?" "That Tuesday night in November," she said, "when I woke up and went out to the smokehouse and smelled the brine." She picked up the letters. "I knew then that if it worked the way I thought it might, we needed to treat it accordingly, not as inventory to move, as something that needed to find the right home." He looked at the letters. "You're not afraid?" he said. "Of waiting again?" She thought about it honestly because he deserved an honest answer. "I'm afraid of moving fast and landing somewhere mediocre," she said. "That's worse than waiting." He nodded. He understood that. He'd had enough time in the past 3 months to come to understand many things about Hazel that he'd been only partly aware of for the first 4 years of their marriage, and this was one of them, that her patience wasn't passivity. It was strategy. It cost her the same amount. It would have cost anyone, possibly more, but she paid it on purpose, deliberately, because she'd calculated that the return was worth it. He sealed the last letter himself and handed it to her. "But," The first response came 11 days later. It came from the Denver man, Harlan Cross, the specialty food importer. And it was shorter than Hazel had expected, which she'd learned to recognize as a good sign. People who weren't interested wrote long letters explaining why. People who were interested wrote short ones asking direct questions. Harlan Cross's letter said, "I would like to taste this product. I can be in Laramie on the 22nd of January. Can you transport a sample? I will cover your travel expenses in exchange for the opportunity to evaluate." She read it twice. Then she handed it to Silas without comment. He read it, looked up. "He'll cover travel." "He wants us there badly enough to pay for us to come," she said. "That's the real content of the letter." "When do we write back?" "Tomorrow," she said. "Not today." He understood that too. The deliberate space, the refusal to respond with the speed of someone who'd been waiting. She wrote back the following morning, in the same measured tone as her original letter, confirming January 22nd in Laramie and asking two specific questions about Harlan Cross's distribution network that she'd already researched enough to know were the right questions. The second response came 3 days after that. The Laramie restaurant owner, a man named Peter Graves, who'd come from New York 12 years earlier and built a reputation in Laramie for food that was better than the territory expected, wrote a longer letter full of specific and well-informed questions about the curing process, the breed of animals, the wood used for smoking. The questions were the questions of someone who knew enough to ask them, which meant he was exactly the kind of buyer she'd been looking for. She answered every question in detail. The hotel in Cheyenne wrote back last, and most formally, and expressed polite interest in a way that she recognized as genuine but cautious. She put that letter aside as a third priority, behind Cross and Graves, because polite caution from a hotel provisioner was a buyer for ordinary product, and she wasn't in the business of ordinary. Fenner had a reaction to all of this that she hadn't expected. He came on a Thursday, the regular cadence he'd established without anyone formalizing it, and she showed him the letters over supper. He read them slowly. He read everything slowly, which she'd come to understand was not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. And when he finished, he set them on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Harlan Cross," he said. "You know him?" "I know of him. Everybody in specialty food trade west of the Mississippi knows of him." He picked up the letter and read the signature again. He's not a small contact, Hazel." "I know," she said. Fenner set the letter down. "How did you know to write to him?" "His name comes up in the periodicals I subscribe to, specifically in the context of Western regional producers. He's been trying to find Western product that meets an Eastern standard of quality." She paused. "I read for a reason." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were preparing for this before September," he said, "before the pigs." It wasn't a question exactly, but it asked for confirmation. "I've been reading trade publications for 2 years," she said. "I wasn't sure what I was preparing for. I knew it was something." He sat back in his chair, and she saw something cross his face that took her a moment to identify, partly because it was complex and partly because she hadn't expected it. It was grief. Not for her. For himself. For something in himself, and something in his own past that was responding to what he was seeing in her kitchen with a recognition that cut in more than one direction. "In Missouri," he said, "I had product like this. I had the right product." He stopped. "I didn't know how to find the right buyers. I waited for them to come to me." He looked at the table. They didn't come fast enough. He didn't say anything more than that, and she didn't ask him to. She poured more coffee, and they sat in the way they'd learned to sit together over the past 2 months, companionably, with long silences that didn't require filling, two people who respected each other's interior life enough not to insist on constant access to it. After a while, she said, "You helped us build something right. Whatever happens in Laramie, that's partly yours." He didn't dismiss it. He didn't deflect with false modesty. He just looked at her and nodded once, and she understood that was the whole of what he could do with it tonight, and it was enough. The 22nd of January arrived on a Tuesday with clear sky and brutal cold that made the road to Laramie a thing to be approached with serious respect. They'd packed the sample hams in straw and wrapped them in oilcloth and loaded them the night before, so that in the morning the only thing left to do was harness the horse and go. Hazel had slept reasonably well, which surprised her. She'd expected the pre-meeting anxiety to keep her up, but instead she'd slept the flat, dreamless sleep of someone who had done everything that could be done and was now simply waiting to find out. She was in the wagon and ready before Silas had finished his coffee. "You're going to freeze out there," he said from the doorway. "I have 2 coats and a blanket," she said. "Finish your coffee." He came out 2 minutes later and climbed up beside her, and they drove the 12 miles to Laramie in the cold morning with the oilcloth bundle in the back and the sky enormous and pale above them, and neither of them talking much, which was the right way to travel when you were heading toward something important. Harlan Cross was staying at the only hotel in Laramie that called itself a hotel with any conviction, and he came down to the lobby to meet them himself rather than sending someone, which Hazel noted as another signal of genuine interest. He was a small man, compact and deliberate in his movements, with quick dark eyes that assessed without being rude about it, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent too much time traveling and not enough time unpacking. He shook Silas's hand and then Hazel's, and she felt him register that she'd led them into the meeting. She'd walked slightly ahead, not dramatically, just naturally. And she saw him update something internally. "Mr. and Mrs. Rowan," he said, "thank you for making the trip." "Thank you for asking us," she said. He'd arranged a small room off the dining area for the tasting, which was appropriate and considerate. A neutral space, not a dining table full of distractions, just a clean cloth and good light. He poured water for them, and then looked at the oilcloth bundle with the focused attention of a man who'd been thinking about this since November. "Before we open it," he said, "tell me about the process, in detail." She told him. All of it. The blind pigs, the notebook observations, the feed regimen, the smokehouse construction, the brine, the hickory smoked salt. She didn't perform it, didn't add drama she didn't need. She just described it accurately and in order, and he listened the way Fenner listened, with total attention, head slightly tilted, eyes focused somewhere past her as if the information was being converted into something visual in his mind. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The smoked salt in the brine," he said. "Yes." "That's your own method." "Yes." He looked at her. "You understand that no one else is doing that." "I understand that August Fenner, in 37 years, had not encountered it before I did it," she said. "I take that seriously, but not as a guarantee." He nodded slowly. "You know who Fenner is." "I know what he accomplished. He told me about Missouri." Something shifted in Cross's face. "He told you about Missouri himself?" "Over supper," she said. "He's been consulting with us since October." Cross sat back slightly, and she saw him doing the recalculating she'd become familiar with over the past 4 months. That particular adjustment when the information arriving was not what the initial estimate had prepared for. He looked at the oilcloth bundle. "Let's open it," he said. She unwrapped the ham herself, because it was her product, and that felt like the right gesture. The smell reached the room immediately, and she watched Cross react to it. A slight stillness, then a lean forward that he probably didn't realize he did. He cut it himself, thin, precise slices with the knife the hotel kitchen had provided. He tasted. Hazel watched his face. She was good at reading people. She'd been doing it her whole life out of necessity. And what she saw in Harlan Cross's face as he ate the first slice was something she'd only seen in Fenner's face on that kitchen morning 2 weeks ago. Information arriving faster than it could be processed, the mind catching up to what the mouth already knew. He ate a second slice. He set down his fork. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Yes." "This is the finest smoked ham I have tasted west of the Mississippi River." He said it without flourish. A professional delivering a professional assessment, possibly west of the Ohio. The room was very quiet. Silas was very still beside her. She could feel him not moving, the deliberate effort of it. "What would distribution look like?" she said, because she was not going to let this moment become a moment she wept in or celebrated in. Not yet. Not until there was a contract and terms and a real arrangement. The quality of the product was established. Now came the part that would determine what the quality was actually worth. Cross looked at her with something approaching, she thought, pleasure. The pleasure of encountering a person who moved straight to the professional after the personal, because they understood that the professional was where things actually got done. "That depends on your capacity," he said. "This year, next year, going forward." "This year we have 6 hams from this cure," she said. "Next year, if we expand the operation, which we intend to do, We could reasonably produce 20 to 24 depending on what? On whether we can source the right animals consistently. The blind pigs were... She paused. That was a specific circumstance. It won't repeat. But the method works with any well-raised animal, and the feed and cure protocol is what creates the result, not the animal's particular condition. She'd worked through this with Fenner over several evenings. The question of reproducibility. We can reproduce the method. We cannot guarantee every animal will be identical, but we can guarantee every product will meet the standard Fenner described. Cross nodded. He was looking at the ham, then at her, then at the ham again. I'd like to take 4 of the 6 hams, he said, for distribution to 2 clients in Denver who I believe will establish a market demand that justifies a long-term supply arrangement. He paused. The price I'm prepared to offer is... He named a number. Silas made a sound that he suppressed immediately. Hazel kept her face arranged. The number was 3 times what a comparable product would have sold for in Delridge. It was money that changed the mathematics of their winter, and of the spring, and of the following season's planning. It was money that answered several of the doubt questions that had visited her at 2 in the morning for 4 months. For the 4 hams, she said, not agreeing yet. What about the remaining 2? I'd suggest you keep 1 for a further tasting. The Laramie restaurateur, Graves, has already reached out to my office about you, incidentally. She hadn't known that, and kept that reaction equally internal. And the second, keep for your own records, your own tasting. Documentation of the standard. He paused. If you're going to build a business on a specific quality of product, you need a reference point, something you can taste and say, this is the floor, nothing goes out below this. She looked at him for a moment. You've thought about this already, she said. Since your letter arrived in November, he said. I've been thinking about it since then. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Rowan, I encounter a great deal of food product in my work. Most of it is competent. Some of it is good. What you have here is the kind of thing I look for every year and find perhaps once. He paused. I don't want to lose it because the business structure doesn't support it. So yes, I've been thinking. Hazel looked at Silas. He looked back. His face was doing several things simultaneously, and she loved him for the fact that none of those things were triumph. It was all something more complicated and more honest than that, which was the face of a man who had been afraid for a long time, and was now in the first careful minutes of not being afraid. She turned back to Cross. I'd like to discuss terms, she said. They drove back to Delridge in the late afternoon, the pale January sun already dropping toward the horizon, the road empty in both directions. For a long time, neither of them said anything. It was Silas who spoke first, which was not usually how it went. Hazel, he said. When Grover knocked that bill of sale in the mud, he was looking at the road. I stood there and I thought, I can't do this anymore. I don't have it. Whatever it takes, I don't have it anymore. She looked at him. I didn't know that, she said. I know you didn't. I didn't want you to know. He kept his eyes on the road. And then I got back in the wagon, and I drove home, and you were standing in the doorway, and you counted the pigs before I even stopped. He shook his head slightly. 3 blind pigs, and you just started. I was scared too, she said. I know, but you started anyway. He finally looked at her. I've been trying to figure out for 4 months what the difference is, between the way you face things and the way I face things. She thought about it. She didn't give him a quick answer because the question deserved a real one. I don't think it's different, she said finally. I think we're scared of different things. You're scared of failing. I'm scared of not trying. She paused. Both of those are real. Mine just moves differently. He was quiet for a long time. 3 times what I thought we'd get, he said, and his voice had something in it that wasn't quite wonder but lived nearby. For 4 hams, she said, with a long-term arrangement pending. Because of your smoked salt. Because of everything, she said. The pigs and the building and Fenner and the vent 4 inches lower and the corner we tore out and rebuilt. She looked at the road. It was all of it. The horse moved steadily through the cold and the light was going amber around them, and in the back of the wagon, wrapped in oilcloth, 2 remaining hams rode home with them, one for Peter Graves and Laramie, one to keep as a reference, as a floor, as a reminder of what everything they'd built was capable of when they did it right. She put her hands in her coat pockets and felt the folded copy of the terms they'd agreed on with Harland Cross. the paper still slightly warm from being inside her coat. She thought about Grover Hatch's face when they told him. She thought about Marta Voss's eyes doing their inventory. She thought about three blind pigs navigating their pen with the particular careful dignity of animals who'd decided the darkness wasn't going to stop them. She did not think about what she was going to say to anyone in Delridge. She thought about next season. She thought about the pigs they'd need to source. She thought about whether the smokehouse could be modified to handle a larger batch without sacrificing the temperature consistency. She thought about whether Fenner might be willing to consult more formally if they had the means to pay him properly, and what that might look like, and what it might mean to the old man who'd spent too many years in a cold shack eating badly and thinking about Missouri. She thought about the notebook on the table at home, the back pages full of pig observations and construction notes and brine formulations, and 2 a.m. ideas that had turned out to be right. She would need more pages. The horse turned down the last mile of track toward home, and the smoke from the chimney was already visible against the darkening sky, and the smokehouse stood solid against the cold, and for the second time in 4 months, Hazel Rowan allowed herself to feel proud. This time, she let it last a little longer. The letter from Peter Graves arrived on a Thursday in early February, and it was longer than Harlan Cross's had been, which meant Graves was either more interested or more cautious, and by the third paragraph, Hazel had determined it was both. He wrote the way someone wrote when they'd been thinking hard about something and wanted the other person to know it. Not to impress, but because precision mattered to him and he didn't want to be misunderstood. He described, in careful language, the meal he'd built his Laramie restaurant around. Sourced locally where possible, elevated by technique, aimed at the kind of traveler who'd eaten well in the East and didn't want to surrender that entirely just because they were west of everything familiar. He wrote that what Hazel had described in her letter, and what Cross had subsequently confirmed in a communication Graves didn't quote but clearly had received, was the kind of ingredient that changed a dish rather than merely completing it. He wanted to taste it in person. He wanted to come to Delridge. She read that last part twice. He wanted to come here. She showed the letter to Silas at breakfast. He read it and set it down and looked at the window. He wants to see the operation, Silas said. He wants to understand how the product is made, she said. There's a difference. He's not auditing us. He's deciding how to talk about it to his customers. Is that different? The first one feels like an inspection. The second one is somebody trying to tell a story. She folded the letter. A restaurateur who knows what his food is and can tell it honestly. That's how you build a clientele that comes back. Silas looked at the letter. When does he want to come? He says whenever is convenient for us, she said. That's polite. That's him understanding that we have the thing he wants, she said. Write the position down. It matters. She wrote back that afternoon. March, she said. Early March. Once the worst of winter had loosened its grip on the roads. She would have the smokehouse available for his review, and she would be prepared to discuss next season's production timeline. She was deliberate about the word production. Not supply, not inventory, production. A word that implied ongoing process, not leftover product from a one-time gamble. She sealed the letter and set it by the door to go out with Silas on his next trip to town. And then she sat at the table for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. She thought about September. She thought about the bill of sale in the mud. Not with bitterness, with something closer to curiosity about the distance between that moment and this one, and how much of that distance was measurable, and how much of it existed in some dimension she didn't have good language for yet. Word got around Delridge the way words always got around Delridge, not through any announcement, not through any deliberate broadcast, but through the particular osmosis of a small community where people paid close attention to each other's business, whether invited to or not. What spread was imprecise in the details and accurate in the substance. The Rowans had sold product to someone from Denver at a price that nobody knew exactly, but that certain people, based on certain things they'd seen or heard, were estimating at a number that didn't match what most of Delridge had assumed was possible. Clara Purdy was the first person to say it to Hazel directly, which was consistent with Clara's character. She came by on a Wednesday with a basket of dried herbs, she said, were extras she didn't need, which Hazel accepted because she could always use dried herbs, and because she understood the visit was about something other than herbs. I hear the Denver man was pleased, Clara said. He was satisfied, Hazel said. She was specific about the word. Clara looked at her. Satisfied. Satisfied is a professional assessment. Pleased could mean anything. Clara smiled in a way that suggested she was filing that away for future use. Ed says Grover Hatch has been quiet this week, noticeably quiet. Has he? Hazel said, and kept moving the herbs to the shelf. Ed says it's the kind of quiet a man gets when he's recalculating. Clara set the basket on the table. Hazel, you should know that there are people in this valley who have been hoping you'd succeed, who haven't said anything, because saying things in advance of outcomes in a place this small doesn't end well for anyone. But they've been hoping. Hazel turned around. Tell me something honestly, she said. Were you one of them? Clara met her gaze without flinching. I was uncertain, not unfriendly. There's a difference. There is, Hazel agreed. I appreciate the honesty. Clara picked up her basket. Whatever comes next, she said, you earned it. People know that now. She paused at the door. All of it, Hazel. Not just the smoked ham. Hazel understood what all of it meant. It meant the months of being watched and doubted and quietly appraised for things that had nothing to do with smoked meat. It meant the conversations she'd been aware of without being party to. It meant the specific kind of credibility that a woman in Calder County in 1883 could not declare for herself, but had to accumulate like limestone, slowly, piece by piece, until the weight of it was undeniable. She thanked Clara and closed the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment. She didn't feel vindicated, exactly. Vindication required an opponent, and she'd been trying, these past months, not to think of anyone as an opponent. What she felt was something quieter and more private, the particular satisfaction of having held on to a belief about herself under conditions that were designed, intentionally or not, to erode it. She went back to work. Fenner came the following week, and something was different about the visit from the moment he arrived. He was quieter than usual, which was saying something. He drank his coffee and answered her questions about next season's curing timeline with his usual precision, but underneath the precision, she felt something, a preoccupation, a weight he was carrying into the room. Silas had gone out to the barn after supper. Fenner stayed at the table with his second cup. I've been thinking about leaving the shack, he said. Hazel looked at him. Not the territory, he said quickly, as if that were the concern. Just the shack. I've been out there too long alone. I know that. He looked at his coffee. There's a room at the Del Ridge boarding house, Mrs. Kemper's place. I inquired about it. When? She said. Last week. He was quiet for a moment. I went to town for the first time in 3 months. It was... He paused. Strange. I'd forgotten how much I disliked it. She didn't smile, though she wanted to. What made you go? He looked at her in the flat, direct way he had. You, he said. This. What you've built here. He set down his cup. I've been sitting in that shack for 6 years telling myself it was peace. It wasn't peace. It was surrender with a better name. He looked at the table. Watching you refuse to surrender. To the valley, to the money pressure, to people who thought they knew what your animals were worth. I kept thinking about Missouri, about what I walked away from. Not because I had to, because I stopped believing it was still possible. He said it carefully and without self-pity, which made it heavier rather than lighter. It was still possible, she said. It was possible here. You helped make it possible. I know. He looked up. That's why I went to town. She thought about the right response to that for a moment. She could have said something generous and warm, and he would have tolerated it politely and been slightly uncomfortable with it, because that wasn't what they were to each other. Mrs. Kemper's room has a south window, she said. Better light for reading. He looked at her. Clara Purdy mentioned it once, she said. She said the south room is the best one. Something moved in Fenner's face, that almost smile she'd seen there occasionally, the one that appeared when he encountered precision he respected. I'll take that into consideration, he said. Peter Graves came to Delridge on the 3rd of March, which arrived with pale sunlight and mud, as March in Wyoming territory always did, the thaw beginning its slow, uncertain work. The road soft in the afternoon and frozen again by morning, everything in that difficult in-between state where winter wasn't finished but had lost its authority. Graves was tall, lean, with the slightly watchful quality of someone who'd spent years assessing environments and deciding quickly whether they were worth his time. He'd come from New York 12 years ago, and it was still visible in the way he carried himself, not as pretension, but as a certain economy of movement, an assumption that time had value. He looked at the smokehouse for a long time. Then he turned to Hazel and said, "Can I see inside?" She took him in. She took him through the whole thing, the construction, the vent placement, the hanging positions, the specific way she managed the fire feed. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that came from someone who understood technique in a related domain and was mapping what he knew onto what he was learning. He didn't pretend to know more than he did, which she appreciated. False expertise was exhausting. When they came out, he stood in the March mud and looked at the land around them and said, "This is the whole operation, just the two of you." "And August Fenner Consulting," she said. He looked at her. "You have August Fenner." "He came to us," she said. "In October." Graves was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't consulted with anyone in years. I tried to reach him 2 years ago. He didn't respond." "He came to our door," she said simply, "because we were doing something he recognized." Graves looked at the smokehouse again. I was putting something together. She could see it. The particular expression of a person understanding not just the product, but the story behind the product, and understanding that the story was itself part of the value. "I want to use your ham as the centerpiece of a spring menu," he said, "specifically a dish where nothing overwhelms it. Simple preparation, appropriate accompaniments, something that lets the product speak." He looked at her. "I want to call it by its origin. Rowan ham from Calder County. Not just smoked ham, not just Wyoming ham. Your name on my menu." She'd thought she was prepared for this meeting. She'd prepared for pricing conversations and supply discussions and the logistics of transport over 50 miles of variable road. She had not prepared for her name on someone's menu in Laramie. She kept her face arranged. "What volume for the spring menu?" she said. He told her. It was compatible with what she'd projected for next season's expanded production. Not comfortable. Production at that level would require real organizational work, more animals sourced earlier, adjustments to the smokehouse to handle larger batches while preserving the temperature consistency she refused to sacrifice. But compatible. They talked for 2 hours, standing and walking and occasionally going back inside the smokehouse or the barn, Silas joining them for the second hour, Hazel leading but not excluding. When they arrived at terms they both found acceptable, Graves looked at his handwritten notes and then at her and said, "You've done this before, negotiated." "No," she said. "You haven't." "Not like this." He looked at her steadily. "Then where does it come from?" She thought about the honest answer. "From knowing what I have," she said, "and knowing what it took to make it." He nodded as if that were the correct answer, which she supposed it was. After Graves left, Silas sat at the kitchen table and looked at the terms they'd written down and didn't say anything for several minutes. "Next season," he said finally. "We need how many animals?" 8 to 10, she said. "To meet Graves and maintain the cross arrangement and have enough to build reserve." "Where do we source them?" "That's what I've been thinking about." She sat down across from him. "There are 2 failed homesteads north of town where people left livestock operations behind. Incomplete, but the groundwork is there. I want to look at them." She paused. "And I want to talk to Rolf Voss." Silas looked up. "Voss?" "He's been in this valley 9 years. He knows the livestock networks in 3 counties. She held his gaze. "He offered, back in December. I wasn't ready to take him up on it then." "And now?" "Now I know what we need, which means I know what to ask for." She paused. "Accepting help when you know exactly what help you need isn't weakness. It's efficiency." He looked at her for a moment. 4 months ago, you wouldn't have said that." 4 months ago, I was protecting something that hadn't proven itself yet," she said. "That required a different kind of caution." She looked at the terms they'd written down. "This is different now. We're not defending a position. We're building one." He was quiet. Then, "I'm going to need you to explain to me, slowly, at some point, how you know the difference between the kind of caution that protects you and the kind that holds you back." She considered it. "I don't always know in the moment," she said. "Sometimes I only know in retrospect." She paused. "September, I didn't know if I was being patient or being stubborn. I know now that it was patient, but I wasn't certain then. What made you keep going when you weren't certain?" She thought about it honestly. I was more afraid of looking back and knowing I'd quit than I was of failing, she said. That's all it was. Not bravery, just a specific allocation of fear. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the window, at the March mud and the pale sun. I want to build a second smokehouse, he said, before next winter. She hadn't expected that from him. She'd been thinking it for 3 weeks, turning it over, calculating, but she'd been waiting for the right moment to propose it. So do I, she said. He looked back at her. How long have you been thinking about it? Since January, she said. Since the road back from Laramie. He shook his head slightly, not with exasperation, but with the amused resignation of a man who'd grown accustomed to discovering his wife was several moves ahead of him and had decided that was more useful than it was frustrating. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. She told him. Rolf Voss came when Hazel asked him, which he did without making her ask twice or feel the cost of the asking, and she appreciated that more than she said. He sat at their kitchen table in the second week of March and listened to what she needed. Animals, sourcing networks, contacts in adjacent counties. And he answered each point with the 9 years of valley knowledge she'd been counting on him to have. He didn't volunteer opinions about how they should run their operation. He answered the question she asked and stopped when the answer was complete, which was a discipline she recognized as uncommon and valuable. When they were done, he sat for a moment. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it plainly. She waited. My wife and I were wrong about you, he said. Not about the pig specifically. About you, about what you were capable of. He looked at the table. We've been in this valley long enough that we thought we knew what was possible here. We'd seen enough people fail that we'd started seeing failure before it happened. He paused. That's its own kind of blindness. She looked at him. I know, she said. I think about that sometimes. How failure can become its own prophecy if enough people believe in it hard enough. He nodded. Marta wants to come by, he said, when you have time, not for any purpose, just to... She wants to see what you've built. She's welcome any time, Hazel said, and she meant it, not as a performance of graciousness, not as an opportunity to display anything. She genuinely meant it because Marta Voss had arrived at the door in September with a $30 offer that was partly condescension and partly, she'd come to understand, genuine worry about what would happen to a young couple who'd made a desperate bet in a hard valley. The worry had been real, even if the form it took was wrong. People were almost never entirely one thing. She'd learned that from 3 blind pigs who were almost never just what they appeared to be. Fenner moved into Mrs. Kemper's south room in the 3rd week of March. Hazel knew because Clara told her, which was how Hazel knew most things that happened in Delridge without being present for them. She didn't make any occasion of it. She didn't ride into town to welcome him or mark the moment in any visible way. But the following Thursday, when she drove in for supplies, she brought a jar of preserved pears and left it at Mrs. Kemper's with a note that said only, "The south window is good, HR." She heard later, through Clara, that he'd kept the note. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she just let it sit in her chest as what it was, which was the specific warmth of knowing that a connection you'd built in difficult circumstances had survived the circumstances and become something that stood on its own. Well, the second smokehouse broke ground in April. Not a copy of the first. They'd learned too much from building the first one to simply repeat it. This one was larger, with 2 vent systems rather than 1, designed to handle twice the hanging volume while maintaining the temperature consistency she'd refused to sacrifice the first time and wouldn't sacrifice now. Silas had drawn the plans himself over several evenings at the kitchen table, checking with Hazel at each stage, and the drawings were better than anything either of them had managed in September because they had knowledge now that they hadn't had then. The limestone was easier to source this time. Rolf Voss had pointed them toward an outcropping on the adjacent property whose owner was willing to trade access for a side of cured pork come winter, which was, Hazel thought, the most satisfying kind of arrangement, the product paying for its own production before it was even made. The valley watched the second smokehouse go up with a different quality of attention than it had watched the first one. The first time, the watching had been the watching of people waiting for something to fail. She'd felt it, that particular quality, the way you could feel weather coming before it arrived. This time it was something else. Not celebration. The valley wasn't given to celebration of individual success in any effusive way, which was its own kind of honesty about the isolation and hardship they all shared. But something had shifted in the quality of the attention. It was the watching of people who'd updated their estimate of what was possible here, and who were, in their own quiet and unsentimental way, deciding what to do with that update. Two families asked Silas, over the course of April, about the feed protocols, not the curing process. They understood that was proprietary, that it was the specific product of Hazel's years of reading and thinking and 2 a.m. ideas. But the feeding, the animal management, the behavioral observation approach. Silas answered honestly and without withholding, because Hazel had told him, the feeding protocol is not what makes the product. The product is made by everything together. You can share pieces without giving away the whole. He'd looked at her when she said it and said, "You've thought about what to share." "Of course I have," she'd said. But summer arrived with its particular Wyoming bluntness. The cold simply stepped aside one week in late May, and the heat came through without much transition, and the valley went from brown to green in what felt like a single week, and the animals they'd sourced through Rolf Voss's network arrived at the homestead in 2 separate groups and settled into the expanded pens Silas had finished in April. 8 animals. Not blind. There was no repeating that specific circumstance, and Hazel had never needed to repeat it, because the blindness had never been the point. The point had always been the care, the observation, the refusal to let anxiety drive the calendar. She started a new notebook, not the flour sack one. That one was full, both the account pages in the front and the observation pages in the back, and she'd put it on the shelf above the kitchen window beside the ribbon Silas had given her at Christmas, where she could see both of them from the stove. The new notebook was a proper one, purchased from Donahue's, with a brown cover and clean pages. She wrote the date at the top of the first page and then sat for a moment. Then she wrote, 8 animals, strong and well-sourced. Same principles, new season. The method holds. The question now is whether the method scales. She underlined the last sentence, because that was the real question, the one she'd been circling since January. Not whether what they'd done was good. Crossan Graves and Fenner had answered that. The question was whether good could become consistent at a larger scale without the care that had made it good in the first place leaking out through the expansion. She'd seen that happen to things she'd admired. A quality present in the small version that couldn't survive the growth of it. The particular attention that was possible with 3 animals becoming impossible with 10. The thing that made it exceptional becoming diluted into something merely competent. She was not going to let that happen. She didn't know precisely how to prevent it yet, but she'd written it down, which was where all the things she was going to figure out started. On an evening in late June, Silas came in from the expanded pig pens and sat down at the table with the expression she recognized as the one he wore when he'd been thinking about something significant and had reached a conclusion he wasn't sure how to present. She put food on the table and sat down and waited. "I've been thinking about what this becomes," he said. "Long term, 5 years, 10 years. "So have I," she said. "And?" "I think it stays the same size," she said, "or close to it." He looked at her. "We could expand." "We could," she said. "And if we did, within 3 years we'd be producing a product that was still good but wasn't what Cross described in January. And the name on Graves's menu would start meaning something different than it means now." She paused. "The value is the specificity. We lose the specificity if we scale past the point where we can personally oversee every stage." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the ambition most people would have," he said, "given where we started." "I know." She looked at her food. "But I'm not most people. And the ambition isn't to be large. The ambition is to be right." She paused. "We can be right and be prosperous without being large. Those aren't the same thing." He sat with that for a while. "Grover Hatch told Ed Purdy," he said slowly, "that he thinks we'll be the best small operation in the territory within 2 years." She looked up. "When did Grover say that?" "Last week. Ed told me." Silas had a careful expression, like he wasn't sure yet how she'd receive it. He said it seriously, not as a backhanded thing. She thought about Grover Hatch standing in their yard last October, looking at the smokehouse with the expression of a man revising an estimate. She thought about this bill of sale spinning in the September mud. She thought about the way she'd walked out of Donahue's store after refusing to rush the process, hands not quite steady on the wagon reins. "I hope he's right," she said simply. Silas looked at her. "That's all? What else is there?" She picked up her fork. "The man made a bad call in September and he's updating his position. That's all anyone can do." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in the particular way he had of expressing that she was being exactly herself, and he found that, still, after 4 years and one very difficult season, something worth noticing. "I put the bill of sale in a frame," he said, "the one Grover knocked in the mud." She set down her fork. "You did what?" "It dried flat. I found a small frame in the barn from the people who had this place before us." He looked at her steadily. "I put it on the wall in the smokehouse." She stared at him. "Silas." "It seemed right," he said. He wasn't backing down from it. "I wanted to put something on that wall that reminded us how close it came. Not so we'd be afraid. So we'd know that what we built came from a moment where everything could have gone the other way." She looked at him for a long time. This man who'd stood in the mud in September with fear all over him and trembling hands, who'd driven 3 miles home alone with 3 blind pigs in the back of the wagon, who'd blistered his hands on limestone and rebuilt a corner twice, and held on for 3 weeks when every voice around him was saying to let go, who had, this past winter, become someone she trusted in a way she hadn't completely known how to trust before. Not because he'd become different, but because the difficulty had revealed something in him she'd seen in glimpses and now knew all the way through. "Show me," she said. They walked out together in the June evening, through the warm air, past the pens where 8 healthy animals moved with the unhurried confidence of creatures that had been cared for well. She could smell the hickory that still lived in the walls of the first smokehouse, even when no fire was burning, that deep-settled presence of a smell that had worked its way into the stone over months. Silas opened the smokehouse door. On the wall beside the door, in a small wooden frame, was a mud-stained bill of sale from September the 14th, 1883. 3 pigs, $40. The paper was wrinkled from where it had absorbed the mud and then dried. You could still see the boot print impression in the lower corner from where someone had stepped on it in the street before Silas picked it up. Hazel looked at it for a long time. She thought about who she'd been when that paper hit the ground. Not different from who she was now. She'd always been herself. That was the thing nobody understood from the outside. That she hadn't changed or grown into something new. She'd simply been given the conditions to be what she already was without apology. She'd been ready before September. She'd been ready for years, carrying the information and the patience and the 2 a.m. ideas and the notebooks full of observations, waiting for the moment when the conditions required her to use them. The moment had arrived in the form of $40 and 3 blind animals and a man in the street who laughed. She looked at the bill of sale in its small frame. She thought about what it meant to persist when persistence looked like foolishness. About what it meant to hold a position when every voice around you is saying to let go, not because you're certain you're right, but because the alternative, letting other people's fear make your decisions, was something you decided you couldn't live with. About the difference between patience and passivity, between waiting and giving up, and how the people who'd never had to hold that distinction in their hands for months at a time were the ones most likely to confuse them. She thought about 3 animals who'd navigated darkness without panic, who'd memorized their space and moved through it with care, who'd become, through the intersection of their particular nature and her particular attention, something nobody in the territory had tasted before. She reached out and straightened the frame slightly on the wall. Then she stepped back and looked at it one more time. "Leave it there," she said. "I plan to," Silas said. She turned and looked at the smokehouse around her. The vent 4 inches lower than she'd planned it, the northeast corner rebuilt twice, the walls that had held 40 days of hickory smoke and come out the other side as something that Harlan Cross and Peter Graves and August Fenner had called exceptional. The walls that had held her 2 a.m. ideas and her careful measurements and her refusal, at every stage, to let fear make the calendar. Outside, the June evening was long and warm, and the second smokehouse was nearly ready, and the new notebook had its first page written, and August Fenner was reading in a south-facing room in Delridge, and the 8 animals in the expanded pens were settling into the particular calm that came from being tended consistently by people who knew what they were doing. None of it was finished. That was the thing she carried with her out of the smokehouse and into the evening light, not as anxiety, but as fact. Nothing worth building was ever finished. You made the thing, and then you maintained it, and then you improved it, and then you passed it on or you started again. And at every stage, the only real question was whether you were bringing the same quality of attention to this year that you'd brought to the last one. She was. She intended to keep doing so. Silas closed the smokehouse door behind them, and they walked back to the house through the warm June evening, and the valley spread out around them. The same valley that had laughed in September, that had watched and doubted and slowly updated, that had sent its apologies through back channels and eventually in person. And it looked, in the long horizontal light of a Wyoming summer evening, like a place where something had been proven. Not to the valley, to themselves. That was the one that mattered and the one that lasted, and Hazel Rowan had known that since September, had known it probably since before September, had known it in the deep, quiet way. You know the things that turn out to be true about yourself when everything else is stripped away, and all that's left is the work and the choice of whether to keep doing it. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She opened the new notebook to the second page.